Chapter 1 of A Little Country Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. A Little Country Girl by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 1. On the Eolus. It was on one of the cool, brilliant days which early June brings to the Narragansett country that the steamer Eolus pushed out from Wickford Pier on her afternoon trip to Newport. The sky was of a beautiful translucent blue. The sunshine had a silvery rather than a golden radiance. A sea wind blew up the western passage, so cool as to make the passengers on the upper deck glad to draw their wraps about them. The low line of the mainland, beyond Conanicut and down to Beaver Tail, glittered with a sort of clear-cut radiance, and seemed lifted a little above the water. Candace Arden heard the captain say that he judged, from the look of things, that there was going to be a change of weather before long. Captain Peleg King was a great favorite on his line of travel. He had a pleasant, shrewd face, grizzled hair, a spare, active figure, and he seemed to notice every one of his passengers and to take an interest in them. "Going down to Newport, miss?" he said to Candace, after giving her one or two quick looks. The question was superfluous, for the Eolus went nowhere else except to Newport, but it was well meant, for the captain thought that Candace seemed lonely and ill at ease, and he wished to cheer her up. "Yes, sir," she answered shyly. "Your folks there for the summer?" he went on. "No, sir. I'm going to stay with my cousin, Mrs. Gray." "Mrs. Courtenay Gray, you mean, I guess. Well, it's queer, but I sort of thought that you favored her a little. She's down early this year. I fetched her and the family across on my evening trip more'n 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Gray's a mighty nice lady. I'm always pleased when she comes aboard. Wouldn't you like to take a seat at the wheelhouse, miss? The wind's blowing pretty fresh." Candace was not aware that this was a distinguishing attention which the captain did not pay to everybody, and which she owed partly to her connection with Mrs. Gray, and partly to her solitary look, which had touched Captain Peleg's benevolent heart. He had a girl of his own over to Wickford, who was about the same age, and it made him kind of tender toward other girls who didn't seem to have any one to look after them. But the wind was fresh, and it was pleasant to be spoken to and noticed by someone on this, the first long journey of her short life, so she thankfully accepted the captain's invitation and let him escort her along the deck, and assist her to mount the 2 steps which led into the wheelhouse. It was rather a pleasant-looking place in which she found herself. 3 sides of the little enclosure were lined with windows, through which the green shores, which seemed to be rapidly drifting past them, could be seen. The 4th side was filled with a long, cushioned bench. In the middle of the glass front was a big brass wheel, shining with polish and friction, and revolving artistically in the hands of its steersman, who kept his eyes fixed alternately on the water and on his compass. There seemed to be no regulation against speaking to this man at the wheel, or if there were, it was not strictly regarded, for 2 young ladies, who were already ensconced in one corner of the long seat, were plying him with all manner of questions. They were rather pretty girls, of that hard modern type which carries the air of knowing everything worth the knowing, having a right to everything worth the having, and being fully determined to claim that right to its fullest extent. As Candace entered, they favored her with one rapid, scrutinizing glance that took in every detail of her apparel, from the goatskin boots, which were too large for her feet, to the round hat whose every bow bore witness to a country milliner, and after that they noticed her no more. She, for her part, only too glad to be left unnoticed, looked shyly out of the corners of her eyes at them. They seemed to her inexpressibly stylish, for their tailor-made suits, though almost as plain as her own dress and jacket of blue alpaca, had that perfect fit and finish which makes the simplest dress seem all that can be desired. There was a knowing look to each little detail, from the slender silver bangles which appeared beneath the loose wrinkled wrists of their very long gloves, to the tortoise-shell pins with which their hats were fastened to the tightly braided hair coiled low down on the nape of the neck. Candace's hair fell in curls to her waist. She had always worn it so, and no one had ever thought anything about it. But now, all in a moment, she felt that it was wrong and improper. "Been up to New York, Miss Joy?" said the captain. "No, only as far as the Junction to meet a friend," replied the prettier of the two girls. "Why weren't you on the boat this morning, Captain?" "I was on the boat. I never miss a trip except sometimes the night one in the summer time when the sleeping train is a running. I don't always come over in that. Let me see, how did I come to miss you to day? Oh, I sat in the ladies' cabin all the way, not on deck. But I didn't see you when we landed." "Well, I don't know how it happened, I'm sure. Are your folks down for the season?" "Yes. That is, mamma and I and my brother are here. My married sister won't come till next month." Then she turned to her friend, but without lowering her voice. "You can't think how dull it's been, Ethel. No men, no dinners, nothing on as yet. The casino is only just opened, and people haven't begun to go there. We tried to get up a tennis match, but there weren't enough good players to make it worth while. There's absolutely nothing. Mrs. Courtney Gray had a girls' lunch on Tuesday, but that is all, and that didn't count for much." "That's Georgie Gray's mother, isn't it? Is she there?" "Oh yes, she and Gertrude, all the Grays. They're as nice and delightful as can be, of course, but somehow they're so literary and quiet. And Mrs. Gray is awfully particular about the girls. She makes them keep on with studying all summer, and she's so exclusive, she won't let them visit half the new people." "Gracious, why not?" "Oh, I don't know. She says they're not good form, and all that. But I'm sure she knows queer people enough herself. There is that tiresome old Miss Gisborne, down in Washington Street. The girls are forever going there, and I've seen them myself ever so many times coming out of the Hares, and they take boarders." "Fancy! How extraordinary! Oh, there are the frigates." For the Eolus, leaving the wooded, wall-like bank of Gall's Island behind, and rounding a point, had now reached the small curving bay to the eastward of Coasters Harbor, where lay the training ships, the New Hampshire and the Minnesota. It was a beautiful sight, the two great war vessels at anchor, with their tall, tapering spars and flying flags reflected in the water on which they floated. Lines of glinting white flashed along the deck, for it was wash day, and the men's clothes were drying in the sun. Two or three barges were disembarking visitors at the gangway ladders, and beyond them a sailboat was waiting its turn to do the same. On the pier a file of blue uniformed boys were marching with measured tread. The sound of their feet came across the distance like the regular beat of a machine. A girl in a rowboat was just pushing out from the farther beach, above which rose a stone house covered with vines. "That's Miss Isherwood," said one of the young ladies. "She's a splendid rower, and Tom says she swims as well as he does." The whole scene was like enchantment to Candace, who had lived all her life among the hills of Connecticut, and had never till that day seen the ocean. She was much too shy to ask questions, but she sat like one in a dream, taking in with wide open eyes all the details of the charming view, the shores, broken by the red roofed villas and cottages rising from clouds of leafy greenery, the Torpedo Island, with its tall flagstaff and floating banner over the dwelling of the commandant, Fort Adams, whose steep glacis seemed powdered with snow just then from the multitude of daisies in bloom upon them, the lighthouses, the soft rises of hill, and beyond the shivering heave of the open sea. Catboats and yachts flitted past in the fair wind like large white-winged moths. Rowboats filled with pleasure parties dipped their oars in the wake of the Eolus. Steam launches with screeching whistles were putting into their docks among old boat houses and warehouses painted dull red or turned of a blackish gray by years of exposure to weather. Behind rose Newport with the graceful spire of Trinity Church and the long bulk of the Ocean House surmounting the quaint buildings on the lower hill. The boat was heading toward a wharf black with carriages which were evidently drawn up to wait the arrival of the Eolus. "There's Mrs. Gray's team now, miss," said the sharp-eyed captain. "Come down for you, I reckon." The two girls glanced at her, and then at each other. They shrugged their shoulders, and Candace heard one of them whisper, "Did you ever?" And the reply, No, but after all we didn't say anything very bad. And who would have dreamed that a hat like that had anything to do with the Greys?" She felt herself blush painfully. The hat was a new one of brown straw trimmed with dark blue ribbon. She had felt rather proud of it when it came home from the milliner's the day before, and had considered the little blue pom-pom with which Miss Wilson, who was authority in matters of fashion in North Tolland, had enriched the middle bow, as a masterpiece of decoration. Alas, the apple of knowledge was at her lips. Already she felt herself blush at the comments of these unknown girls, whose hats were so different from her own, and was thoroughly uncomfortable, though she could hardly have told why. Captain Peleg politely carried her bag for her across the landing plank to where the team, a glossy coupe with one horse, was waiting. He beckoned to the smart coachman, who wore a dark green overcoat with big metal buttons, to draw nearer. "Here's your passenger," he said, helping Candace into the carriage. "Good day, miss. I hope we'll see you again on the Eolus." "All right, driver." "Oh, thank you," cried Candace, finding voice and forgetting shyness in her gratitude. "You've been real kind to me, Captain." "That child's got mighty pretty eyes," soliloquized Captain King as he marched down the wharf. "I wonder what relation she is to the Greys. She don't seem their sort exactly. She's been raised in the country, I expect. But Mrs. Grey'll polish her up if anybody can, or I'm mistaken. Steady there! Where are you about?" as a trunk came bounding and ricocheting across the gangway. "This wharf ain't no skittle ground." Meanwhile the coupé was slowly climbing a steep side street which led to the avenue. Looking forth with observant eyes, Candace noted how the houses, which at first were of the last century build, with hipped roofs and dormer windows, like those to which she was accustomed in the old hill village that had been her birthplace, gave way to modernized old houses with recent additions, and then to houses which were unmistakably new, and exhibited all manner of queer peaks and pinnacles and projections, shingled, painted in divers colors, and broken by windows of oddly tinted glass. Next the carriage passed a modern church, built of pinkish brown stone, and immediately after, the equable roll of wheels showed that they were on a smooth macadamized road. It was, in fact, though Candace did not know it, the famous Bellevue Avenue, which in summer is the favorite drive for all fashionable persons, and thronged from end to end on every fair afternoon by all manner of vehicles, from dainty pony wagons to enormous mail coaches. There were only a few carriages in sight now, though they seemed many to our little country maid. Shops were opening for the season. Men were busy in hanging Eastern rugs and curtains up to view, and arranging in the windows beautiful jars and plates of porcelain and pottery, glittering wares from Turkey and Damascus, carved furniture, and inlaid cabinets. Half a dozen florists exhibited masses of hothouse flowers amid a tangle of palms and tree ferns. Beyond was the announcement of an opening by a well-known dressmaker, whose windows were hung with more beautiful things than Candace in her small experience had ever dreamed of before: laces, silks, embroideries. The shops gave way to houses, each set in a courtyard gay with newly planted beds of flowers or foliage plants. Vines clustered everywhere. The trees, not yet fully in leaf, were like a tossing spray of delicate fresh green. A sense of hope, of expectation, of something delightful which was being prepared for, seemed to be in the air. Suddenly the coupé turned in between a pair of substantial stone gate-posts, and drew up before a large square house, with piazzas on two sides, and a small but very smooth lawn, whose closely cut grass looked like green velvet. It was dappled with weeping trees and evergreens, and hedged with a high wall of shrubs which shut off the view of the street. A continuous flower bed ran all round the house, close to its walls, planted full of geraniums, heliotrope, nasturtiums, mignonette, and pansies. Every window and balcony boasted its box of ferns or flowers, and in spite of the squareness of the building and the sombre green-grey with which it was painted, the general effect was of cheerfulness, and shade broken by color, an effect which is always pleasant. Candace had forgotten herself in the excitement of new sights and experiences, but her shyness came back with a rush as the carriage stopped and the door was opened by a very smart French butler. "Is Mrs. Gray at home?" she asked timidly, bending forward. "Descendez, mademoiselle, s'il vous plaît. Madame est occupée pour le moment. Il y a du monde dans le salon." Then, seeing the perplexed look in Candace's eyes, he explained in broken English: "Miss is to get out. Madame is busy with company for a little while. Miss will please go upstairs." Candace got out. The carriage drove away, and she followed the butler into the hall. He gave a low call at the foot of the stairs, which brought down a lady's maid with a ruffed cap perched on the back of her head. "This way, if you please, miss," she said, and led Candace up the staircase, which was a wide one with 3 square turns and a broad landing, lit with a range of windows and furnished with a low cushioned seat. Then came an upper hall, and she was shown into a pretty corner room. "If you'll please sit down and rest yourself, miss," said the maid. "Mrs. Gray'll be up as soon as some company she has is gone. Would you like to have a cup of tea, miss?" "No, thank you," faltered Candace, and then the maid went away, shutting the door behind her. The room, which had no bed in it, and was, in fact, Mrs. Gray's morning room, was so full of curious things that Candace's first thought was that it would take a week at least to see half that was in it. The sage green walls were thickly hung with photographs, water colors, charcoal sketches, miniatures, bits of faience, lacquered trays and discs, and great shining circles of Syrian and Benares metalwork. There were many pieces of pottery of various sorts set here and there, on the chimney piece, on bookshelves, and on top of a strangely carved black cabinet, with hinges and handles of wrought iron. In one corner stood an Italian spinning wheel of ebony and silver; in another an odd instrument whose use Candace could not guess, but which was in reality a Tyrolean zither. An escritoire, drawn near a window, was heaped with papers and with writing appliances of all sorts and all elegant. There were many little tables covered with books and baskets of crewels and silks, and easy chairs of every description. Every chair back and little stand had some quaint piece of lacework or linen work thrown over it. It was, in fact, one of those rooms belonging distinctly to our modern life, for the adornment of which every part of the world is ransacked, and the products set forth in queer juxtapositions to satisfy or to exhibit the varied tastes and pursuits of its occupants. To Candace it was as wonderful as any museum, and while her eyes slowly travelled from one object to another, she forgot her strangeness and was happy. Tick, 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 went the little French clock on the mantelpiece. Suddenly it struck her that it was a long while that she had been left alone in this room. She glanced at the clock. It really was almost an hour. All her latent homesickness returned with fresh force. Her eyes filled with sudden tears. In another moment she would have been actually crying, but just then came a quick step, a little rustle, and she had just time to wipe away the drops when the door opened and Mrs. Gray hurried into the room. "My poor child!" she exclaimed. "Have you been alone all this time? It is quite too bad. I made sure that I should hear the carriage drive up, and at least run out and give you a welcome, but somehow I didn't, and people came so fast and thick that I couldn't get a chance to glance at the clock." She kissed Candace and looked at her with a sort of soft scrutiny. It was to the full as penetrating as that of the strange girls on the steamer had been, but it did not hurt like theirs. Mrs. Gray had beautiful, big, short-sighted blue eyes with black lashes. When she smiled they seemed to brim with a sudden fascinating radiance. She smiled now, and reminded Candace somehow of a great soft, fully opened garden rose. "You have something of your mother's looks, Cannie," she said. "I knew her best when she was about your age. I never saw much of her after she married your father and went up to live among the hills." She sighed softly. There was a short pause, then with a sudden change of tone she continued: "And all this time you have never been shown your room. I can't think why they were so stupid. Who was it put you in here, Cannie?" "It was a lady in a cap," replied Candace hesitatingly. "A lady? Cap? Oh, it must have been Elizabeth. She's my maid. Don't make such a mistake again, dear. You must learn to discriminate. Well, come with me now. and let me see you comfortably established. The girls are gone on a yachting party to the upper end of the island. It was an old engagement made before your aunt's letter came, or they would not have been absent when you arrived. They were very sorry, but in the very middle of the word came Frederick, the butler, with the announcement of new visitors, and just taking time to lead Candace down the entry to a room whose door stood wide open, Mrs. Gray hurried away, saying rapidly, "Take off your hat, dear. Lie down for a rest. Hadn't you better? I'll be up again presently." "I wonder if everybody is always in a hurry in Newport," Candace thought. But she was alone again, but this time she felt no disposition to cry. Her trunk had been brought up by somebody, and stood already in its place, with the straps unloosened. She took off her hat and jacket, unpacked a little, and peeped out of the window to see where she was. The room faced the east, and across a corner of the lawn and the stable yard she had a glimpse of the sea, which had become intensely blue with the coming of the later afternoon. "Oh, that is good," she said to herself. "I shall see it all summer." She glanced about the room with a growing sense of proprietorship, which was pleasant. It was not a large room, but it looked cheerful, with its simple furniture of pale colored ash and a matted floor, over which lay a couple of Persian rugs. There was a small fireplace, bordered with blue tiles, which matched the blue papering on the walls, and the tiles on the washstand, and the chintz of the easy chair and lounge, and the flower jars on the mantelpiece were blue also. Altogether, it was a pretty little chamber, with which any girl might be sufficiently well pleased, and as Candace noticed the tiny nosegay of mignonette and tea roses which stood on the bureau, her heart lightened with the sense that it had been put there for her. Some one had thought of her coming and prepared for it. She brushed out her curls and washed her face and hands, but did not change her dress. The blue alpaca was the newest she had, and she wished to look her best on that first evening. She sat down in the window to listen to the soft boom of the surf, which seemed to grow louder as the night drew on, and did not hear Mrs. Gray as she came down the entry. The lady stood a moment in the half-open door, surveying her young visitor. "What am I to do with her?" she thought. "I want to befriend Candace's child, but I did not quite realize till I saw her just now what a disadvantage she would be at among all these girls here, with their French clothes and their worse than French ideas. She's not plain. There's a good deal of beauty about that shy little face of hers, and refinement too. If only she were not so awkward! If I can once get her into a dress that fits, and do something with that mop of curls, she would look well enough. I wonder if she will take it kindly, or flare up and feel offended at every suggestion. That would be terrible. You are listening to the surf, dear. I'm afraid it means rain tomorrow. That sound generally is a symptom of mischief." "Is it?" said Candace. "What a pity!" "A pity about the rain?" "No, but it's such a pretty sound." "So it is. Well, if you are ready, let us go downstairs. I expect the girls every moment. Ah, there they are now." The line of windows on the staircase landing commanded a view of the gate and approach, and looking through them Candace saw a village cart with two girls in the front seat, one driving, and a third girl on the rumble behind, approaching the house. A couple of young men on horseback rode close beside the cart. One of them jumped from his horse, helped the young ladies out. There was a moment of laughter and chat, then, touching their hats, the riders departed, and the three girls came into the hall. "Mamma! Mammy, where are you, dear?" sang out three youthful voices. "Here I am, halfway upstairs," replied Mrs. Gray, seating herself on the cushioned bench on the landing. "What on earth are you doing up there? And who's that with you?" "It's your cousin Candace. Come up and be introduced." Up they came at a run, each trying to be the first to arrive. Candace had never known many girls, but these were of a different species from any she had seen before. They seemed full of spirits, and conveyed the idea of being, so to speak, bursting with happiness, though I suppose not one of the three would have resented the imputation of being happier than people in general are or ought to be. Georgie, the eldest, was short and round, and had her mother's blue, near-sighted eyes without her mother's beauty. Gertrude was unusually tall, and had a sort of lily-like grace. Her light hair was very thick and so fine in quality that it stood out like a nimbus round her pale, pretty face. Little Marian, the youngest, 2 years Candace's junior, was not yet in society, but had been allowed to go to the picnic as a great favor. Her hair was a reddish tint in its chestnut, and was braided in one large plait down her back. She had brown eyes and a capable little face which was full of expression. They all spoke kindly to Candace, they all kissed her, but she felt much less at ease with them than with their mother, whose peculiarly charming manner seemed to invite confidence from everybody. After a few questions and a few words of welcome, they plunged into a description of their picnic, the yacht sail, the landing, the luncheon, the general delightfulness of everything. "Berry Joy was not there," remarked Georgie. "She had gone up to Wickford to meet some one. By the way, she must have come down on the Eolus with you, Candace. Did you see her?" "There were two young ladies," answered Candace, timidly. "Did you hear their names? Did you talk to them?" asked Gertrude. "No, yes, no. I mean, Captain called one of them Miss Joy. I didn't talk to them, but they knew you." "Why, how could you tell that?" "I heard them talking about you." "What fun! What did they say?" Candace hesitated. Her face grew crimson. "I don't," she began. Then, with a great effort, rallying her powers, she went on, "I didn't like to sit there and hear them and not tell them that I was your cousin, but I was too frightened to speak to them, so I thought I would never repeat what they said, and then it wouldn't be any matter." "Quite right, Cannie," said Mrs. Gray, quickly. Something in the girl's little speech seemed to please her very much. End of chapter 1. Little Country Girl by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Chapter 2. The First Evening. Candace Arden's mother had not only been Mrs. Gray's cousin, but her particular friend as well. The two girls had been brought up together, and shared their studies and secrets and girlish fun, and had scarcely ever been separated for a week, until suddenly a change came which separated them for all the rest of their lives. Pretty Candace Van Vliet went up to New Haven on her 19th birthday to see what a college commencement was like, and at the president's reception afterward met Harry Arden, the valedictorian of the graduating class, a handsome fellow just 21 years old. He came of plain farming people in the hill country of Connecticut, but he was clever, ambitious, and his manners had a natural charm to which his 4 years of college life had added ease and the rubbing away of any little rustic awkwardness with which he might have begun. Candace thought him delightful. He thought her more than delightful. In short, it was one of the sudden love affairs with which college commencements not infrequently end, and in the course of a few weeks they engaged themselves to each other. Henry was to be a minister, and his theological course must be got through with before they could marry. 3 years the course should have taken, but he managed to do it in a little more than 2, being spurred on by his impatient desire for home and wife, and a longing no less urgent to begin as soon as possible to earn his own bread and relieve his father from the burden of his support. No one knew better than he with what pinching and saving and self-sacrifice it had been made possible for him to get a college education and become a clergyman. What daily self-denials had been endured for his sake in that old yellow farmhouse on the North Tolland hills. He was the only son, the only child, and his father and mother were content to bear anything so long as it gave him a chance to make the most of himself. It is not an uncommon story in this New England of ours. Many and many a farmhouse could tell a similar tale of thrift, hard work, and parental love. The bare rocky acres are made to yield their uttermost, the cows to do their full duty, the scanty apples of the off year are carefully harvested, every pullet and hen is laid under contribution for the great need of the moment, the getting the boys through college. It is both beautiful and pitiful, as all sacrifices must be, but the years of effort and struggle do not always end, as in the case of the Ardens,
with a disappointment and a grief so bitter as to make the self-spending seem all in vain. For the overstudy of those 2 years proved too much for Henry Arden's health. It was not hard study alone. He stinted himself in food, in firing as well. He exacted every possible exertion from his mind, and systematically neglected his body. The examinations were brilliantly passed. He was ordained. He received a call to Little Upshire, the village nearest to North Tolland. There was a pretty wedding in the old Van Vliet mansion on Second Avenue, at which Kate Van Vliet, herself just engaged to Courtenay Gray, acted as bridesmaid. And then the cousins parted. They only met once again, when Mrs. Arden came down from the country to see her cousin married. Henry did not come with her. He was not very well, she explained, and she must hurry back. That was the beginning of a long, wasting illness. Some spring of vitality seemed to have been broken during those 2 terrible years at the theological seminary, and though Henry Arden lived on, and even held his parish for several years, he was never fit for any severe study or labor. The last 3 years of his life were spent in the old farmhouse at North Tolland, where his Aunt Myra, a spare, sinewy, capable old maid, was keeping house for his father. Mrs. Arden had died soon after her son's illness began. Her heart was kind of broken, the neighbors said, and perhaps it was. And little Candace and her mother lived on with the old people after the long, sorrowful nursing was done, and another grey headstone had been placed beside the rest in the Arden lot in the North Tolland graveyard, having carved upon it, "Sacred to the memory of Reverend Henry Arden, aged 34. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be his holy name." There seemed nothing else for them to do but to live on where they were. Mrs. Gray was in China with her husband, who, at that time, was the resident partner in a well-known firm of tea importers. Aunt Van Vliet had gone to Europe after her daughter's marriage. There was no one to come to the aid of the drooping young widow and carry her away from the lonely life and the sad memories which were slowly killing her. For her child's sake she did her best to rally, but her strength had been severely taxed during her husband's illness, and dying was easier than living. So she died when Candace was just 8 years old, and the little girl and the 2 old people were left alone in the yellow farmhouse. A 12-month later, Grandfather Arden had a stroke of paralysis. Don't be too much discouraged, dear children. This is positively the last death that I shall have occasion to chronicle in this story. But it seemed necessary to show what sort of life Candace had lived, in order to explain the sort of girl she was. After her grandfather died, Aunt Myra, aged 69, and little Cannie, aged 9, alone remained of the once large household, and the farmhouse seemed very big and empty, and had strange echoes in all the unused corners. It was a lonely place, and a lonely life for a child. Candace had few enjoyments, and almost no young companions. She had never been used to either, so she did not feel the want of them as most little girls would have done. Aunt Myra was kind enough, and, indeed, fond of her duty in a dry, elderly way, but she could not turn herself into a playmate. It is not often that a person who is as old as 69 remembers how it feels to play. Aunt Myra approved of Cannie especially, because she was such a quiet child, but I think Cannie's mother would rather have had her noisier. "She's as nice a girl as I want to see," Aunt Myra was wont to tell her cronies. "She's likely appearing enough, and that's better than being too pretty, and she's helpful about the house for such a young creetur, and she's not a bit forth-putting or highty-tighty." I don't know how I should have managed if Candace had turned out the sort of girl some of 'em are, like those Buell girls, for instance, always raising Ned because they can't get down to Hartford or Bridgeport to shop and see the sights and have a good time. As if good times couldn't be had to home as well as anywhere. Well, I reckon that Miss Buell has more fuss and trouble in fitting out those girls every spring of her life than I've had with Cannie since her mother died. She never makes one mite of difficulty, or bothers with objections. She puts on whatever I see fit to get her, and she likes it, and there's the end." This was not quite as true as Aunt Myra supposed. Candace wore whatever it was ordained she should wear, but she did not always like it. From her mother she inherited a certain instinct of refinement and taste, which only needed the chance to show itself. But there was little chance to exercise taste in the old yellow farmhouse, and Candace, from training and long habit, was submissive, so she accepted the inevitable and, as her great aunt said, made no difficulty. Letters came now and then from Cousin Kate far away in China, and once a little box with a carved ivory fan as fine as lace work, a dozen gay pictures on rice paper, and a scarf of watermelon pink crepe, which smelt of sandalwood, and was by far the most beautiful thing that Cannie had ever seen. Then, 2 years before our story opens, the Grays came back to America to live, and a correspondence began between Mrs. Gray and Aunt Myra, part of which Candace heard about and part she did not. Mrs. Gray was anxious to know her cousin's child and be of use to her, but first one thing and then another delayed their meeting. The first winter the Grays spent at the hotel looking for a house; the second they were all in Florida on account of Mr. Gray's health. These difficulties were now settled. A town house had been chosen, a Newport cottage leased for a term of years, and Cannie was asked for a long summer visit. It was Mrs. Gray's secret desire that this visit should lead to a sort of adoption, that Cannie should stay on with them as a fourth daughter, and share all her cousin's advantages of education and society. But before committing herself to such a step, she wished to see what the girl was like. "It's so much easier to keep out of such an arrangement than to get out of it," she told her husband. "My poor Candace was an angel, all sweetness and charm. But her child has the blood of those stiff Connecticut farmers in her. She may be like her father's people, and not in the least like her mother. She may be hopelessly stupid, or vulgar, or obstinate, or unimprovable. We will wait and see." This secret doubt and question was, I think, the reason why Mrs. Gray was so pleased at Cannie's little speech about Miss Joy and her friend. That was the true, honorable feeling, she thought to herself. The child is a lady by instinct. It wasn't easy for her to say it either. She's a shy little thing. Well, if she has the instinct, the rest can be added. It's easy enough to polish a piece of mahogany, but you may rub all day at a pine stick and not make much out of it. As these thoughts passed rapidly through her mind, she stole her arm across Candace's shoulders and gave them a little warm pressure, but all she said was, "Dinner in 20 minutes, children. You would better run up at once and make ready. Cannie, you and I will go to the library. You haven't seen my husband yet." The library was a big, airy room with an outlook to the sea. There were not many books in it, only enough to fill a single row of low bookshelves, but the tables were covered with freshly cut magazines and pamphlet novels. There was a great pile of Punch and other illustrated papers, and that air of light reading in abundance which seems to suit a house in summer time. A little wood fire was snapping a pair of very bright andirons, and, June though it was, its warmth was agreeable. Beside it, in an enormous Russia leather armchair, sat Mr. Gray, an iron-whiskered, shrewd-looking man of the world, with a pair of pleasant, kindly eyes, and that shining bald spot on his head which seems characteristic of the modern business man. "Court, here is our new child," said Mrs. Gray. "Poor Candace's daughter, you know." Mr. Gray understood from his wife's tone that she was pleased with her little visitor so far, and he greeted her in a very friendly fashion. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. "I recollect her perfectly, though we only met 2 or 3 times, and that was 17—let me see—nearly 18 years ago it must have been. Her hair, too, I should say," glancing at Cannie's chestnut mop. "It was very thick, I remember, and curled naturally." "Aunt Myra always says that my hair is the same color as mother's," replied Candace. "It is almost exactly the same. Do you remember her at all, Cannie?" asked Mrs. Gray. "Just a little. I recollect things she used to wear, and where she used to sit, and 1 or 2 things she said, but perhaps I don't recollect them, but think I do because Aunt Myra told them to me." "Is there no picture of her?" "Only a tintype, and it isn't very good. It's almost faded out. You can hardly see her face." What a pity! "Le dîner est servi, madame," said the voice of Frederick at the door. "We won't wait for the girls. They will be down in a moment," said Mrs. Gray, as she led the way to the dining room. The sound of their feet on the staircase was heard as she spoke, and down they ran, the elder two in pretty dresses of thin white woollen stuff, which Candace in her unworldliness thought fine enough for a party. People in North Tolland did not dine in the modern sense of the word. They took in supplies of food at stated intervals, very much as a locomotive stops for wood and water when it cannot go on any longer without such replenishment; but it was a matter of business and necessity to do so, rather than of pleasure. Candace, who had sat down opposite Aunt Myra every day as long as she could remember at the small pine table in the yellow painted kitchen, with always the same thick ironstone ware plates and cups, the same little black tray to hold the tea things, the same good substantial prosaic fare, served without the least attempt at grace or decoration, had never dreamed of such a dinner as was usual at the Grays. She said not a word to express her astonishment, but she glanced at the thick cluster of maidenhair ferns which quivered in the middle of the table from an oval stand of repoussé brass, at the slender grasses of tea roses which stood on either side, at the Sèvres dishes of fruit, sweet biscuits, and dried ginger, and wondered if this were to be all the dinner. Did fashionable people never eat anything more substantial than grapes and crackers? She felt very hungry, and yet it seemed coarse not to be satisfied when everything was so pretty. "Consommé, mademoiselle?" murmured Frederick in her ear, as he placed before her a plate full of some clear liquid which smelt deliciously, and offered a small dish of grated cheese for her acceptance. "Oh, thank you, sir," said Candace, wondering confusedly if cheese in soup was the correct thing. Mrs. Gray's quick ear caught the "sir." She did not even turn her head, but she mentally added another to the hints which must be administered to Candace as soon as she was sufficiently at home to bear them. Spanish mackerel was the next course. Candace inadvertently took up the steel knife placed beside her plate, instead of the silver one meant for use with fish. The result was that when the saddle of mutton was served, she had no usable knife. Mr. Gray observed her difficulty, and directed Frederick to bring a steel knife for mademoiselle, which Frederick did, first casting a scrutinizing glance about as if in search of something, and again Candace felt that she was somehow out of the way. The climax of her discomfort came with the pretty tinted fruit plates and finger bowls. Candace's tumbler was empty, and without particularly thinking about the matter, she took a drink out of her finger bowl, which she mistook for some sort of lemonade, from the bit of lemon which floated in the water. The moment after she was conscious of her blunder. She saw Georgie dabbling her fingers in the bowl. She saw Gertrude with difficulty keeping back a smile, which would flicker in her eyes, though her lips were rigidly grave. Little Marian giggled outright, and then relapsed into a frightened solemnity. Candace felt utterly miserable. She looked toward Mrs. Gray apprehensively, but that lady only gave her an encouraging smile. Mr. Gray put a bunch of hothouse grapes on her plate. She ate them without the least idea of their flavor. With the last grape a hot tear splashed down, and the moment Mrs. Gray moved, Candace fled upstairs to her own room, where she broke down into a fit of homesick crying. How she longed for the customary home among the hills, where nobody minded what she did, or how she ate, or had any manners in particular, as she phrased it in her own mind, or thought her ignorant or awkward. And yet, on sober second thought, did she really wish so much to go back? Was it not better to stay on where she was, and learn to be graceful and low spoken and at ease always, like her cousin Kate, if she could, even if she had to undergo some mortification in the process? Candace was not sure. She had stopped crying and was cooling her eyes with a wet towel, when she heard a little tap at the door. It was Mrs. Gray herself. "Where are you, Cannie?" she said, looking about the room with her short-sighted eyes. "You are so dark here that I cannot see you." "I'm here by the washstand," faltered Candace, and then, to her dismay, she began to cry again. She tried to subdue it, but a little sob, which all her efforts could not stifle, fell upon her cousin's observant ear. "My dear child, you are crying!" she exclaimed, and in another minute Candace, she scarcely knew how, was in Mrs. Gray's arms. They were sitting on the sofa together, and she was finishing her cry with her head on the kindest of shoulders, with an unexpected feeling of comfort at her heart. Anything so soft and tender as Cousin Kate's arms she had never known before. There was a perfume of motherliness about them which to a motherless girl was wholly irresistible. Gertrude declared that mamma always stroked people's troubles away with those hands of hers, and that they looked just like the hands of the Virgin in Holbein's Madonna, as if they could mother the whole world. "Now, tell me, Cannie, tell me, dear child," said Mrs. Gray, when the shower was over and the hard sobs had grown faint and far between. "What made you cry? Was it because you were tired and a little homesick among us all? Or were you troubled about anything? Tell me, Cannie." "Oh, it's only because I'm so stupid and countrified," said Candace, beginning to sob again. "I made such horrid mistakes at dinner, and Gertrude wanted to laugh. She didn't laugh, but I saw her want to, and Marian did laugh, and I felt so badly." "Marian is such a little girl that you must forgive her this once," said Mrs. Gray, "though I am rather ashamed of her myself. I saw all your mistakes, as you call them, Cannie, even one or two that you didn't see yourself. They were very little mistakes, dear, not worth crying about. Small blunders in social etiquette, which is a matter of minor importance, not failures in good feeling or good manners, which are of real consequence. They did not make anybody uncomfortable except yourself." "Cousin Kate," Candace ventured to ask, "will you tell me why there is such a thing as etiquette? Why must everybody eat and behave and speak in the same way, and make rules about it? Is it any real use?" "That is rather a large question, and leads back to the beginning of things," said Mrs. Gray, smiling. "I don't suppose I quite understand it myself, but I think I can make you understand a part of it. I imagine when the world was first peopled, in the strange faraway times of which we know almost nothing except the hints we get in the Bible, that the few people there were did pretty much as they liked. Noah and his family in the ark, for instance, probably never sat at any tables or had any regular meals, but just ate when they were hungry, each one by himself. Savage tribes do the same to this day. They seize their bone or their handful of meat and gnaw it in a corner, or as they walk about. This was the primitive idea of comfort. But after a time people found it was less trouble to have the family food made ready at a certain time for everybody at once, and have all come together to eat it. Perhaps at first it was served in one great pot or dish, and each one dipped in his hand or spoon. The Arabs still do this. Then of course the strongest and greediest got the most of everything, and it may have been some weak or slow person who went hungry in consequence, who invented the idea of separate plates and portions. "But that is not etiquette," objected Cannie. "People have plates and set tables everywhere now, in this country, I mean." "Yes, but can't you imagine a time when to have a bowl or a saucer to yourself was considered finical and stuck up, and when some rough Frank or Gaul from the mountains looked on disapprovingly, and said that the world was coming to a pretty pass if such daintiness was to be allowed? A bowl to oneself was etiquette then. All sorts of things which to us seem matter of course and commonplace began by being novelties and subjects for discussion and wonderment. Remember that tea, potatoes, carpets, tobacco, matches, almost all our modern convenience, were quite unknown even so lately as 400 or 500 years ago. As the world grew richer, people went on growing more refined. The richest folk tried to make their houses more beautiful than the houses of their neighbors. They gave splendid feasts and hired sculptors and artists to invent decorations for their tables, and all kinds of little elegant usages sprang up which have gradually become the custom of our own day, even among people who are not rich and do not give feasts." "But do they mean anything? Are they of any real use?" persisted Cannie. I confess that some of them do not seem to mean a great deal. Still, if we look closely, I think we shall find that almost every one had its origins in one of two causes. Either it was a help to personal convenience, or in some way it made people more agreeable, or less disagreeable, to their neighbors. We have to study, and to guess a little sometimes, to make out just why it has become customary to do this or that, for the original reason has been forgotten, or perhaps does not exist any longer, while the custom remains. "I wonder," said Cannie, whose mind was still running on her own mishaps, "why people mustn't cut fish with a steel knife. I read in a book once that it was not genteel to do so, and I couldn't think why, and then to night I didn't see the little silver one. I imagine that in the first instance some old gourmet discovered or fancied that a steel knife gave a taste to fish which injured it. So people gave up using knives, and it grew to be said that it was vulgar and a mark of ignorance to cut fish with them. Then, later, it was found to be quite comfortable always to tear your bit of fish apart with a fork and hold it down with a piece of bread while you did so, and the custom arose of having a silver knife to cut fish with. It is a convenient custom, too, for some reasons. Waiting on table is quite an art nowadays, when there are so many changes of plates, and a good waiter always tries to simplify what he has to do, by providing as much as possible beforehand. You can see that if each person has beside his plate a silver knife for fish and a steel knife for meat, and two forks, these two courses will go on more easily and quietly than if the waiter has to stop and bring a fresh knife and fork for each person before he helps to the dish, whatever it is. But why is there nothing on the table but flowers and pretty things, and why do they put lemon peel in the bowls of water?" "Well, the lemon is supposed to take the smell of dinner away from the fingers, and it isn't always lemon. Frederick is apt to drop in a geranium leaf, or a sprig of lemon verbena, and those are nicer. As for the other thing, it is more important for many reasons not to have the carving done on the table. But aside from that, I imagine that in the first instance the custom was a matter of economy." "Economy!" repeated Candace, opening wide her eyes. "Yes, economy, though it seems droll to say so. In the old days, when the meat came in on a big platter, and the vegetables each in its large covered dish, people had to put more on table than was really wanted, for the sake of not looking mean and giving their neighbors occasion for talk. Now, when everything is carved on a side table, and a nice little portion carried to each person, you are able to do with exactly what is needed. There need not be a great piece of everything left over for look's sake. One chicken is enough for 4 or 5 people if it is skillfully carved, but the chicken would look rather scanty on a platter by itself. Don't you think so?" "Yes," said Cannie with a little laugh. She had forgotten her troubles in the interest of the discussion. A dish containing 1 mutton chop and a spoonful of peas for each person would be called a stingy dish in the country, where one sees his food on the table before him," continued Mrs. Gray, "but it is quite enough for the single course it is meant to be at a city dinner. There is no use in having 3 or 4 chops left over to toughen and grow cold." "I see," said Cannie thoughtfully. "What else did I do that was wrong, Cousin Kate?" "You called Frederick 'sir,'" replied her cousin with a smile. "That was not wrong, but not customary. Servants are expected to say 'sir' and 'ma'am' to their employers as a mark of respect, and people not servants use the word less frequently than they formerly did. They keep such terms for elderly or distinguished persons, to whom they wish to show special deference." "But Aunt Myra always made me say 'sir' and 'ma'am' to her and grandpapa. She said it was impolite not to." "She was quite right, for she and your grandfather were a great deal older than yourself, and it was only respectful to address them so. But you need not use the phrase to everybody to whom you speak." "Not to you?" "Well, I would quite as soon that in speaking to me you said 'Yes, Cousin Kate,' as 'Yes, ma'am.' That is what I have taught my children to do. They say 'Yes, mamma.' Did you call me papa? And I like the sound of it better, but it is only a matter of taste. There is no real right or wrong involved in it." Candace sat for a moment in silence, revolving these new ideas in her mind. "Cousin Kate," she said timidly, "will you tell me when I make little mistakes, like that about the knife? I'd like to learn to do things right if I could, and if it wouldn't trouble you too much." "Dear Cannie," and Mrs. Gray kissed her, "I will, of course, and I am glad you like to have me. Your mother was the sweetest, most refined little lady that I ever knew. I loved her dearly, and I should love to treat you as I do my own girls, to whom I have to give a hint or a caution or a little lecture almost every day of their lives. No girl ever grew into a graceful, well bred woman without many such small lessons from somebody. If your mother had lived, all these things would have come naturally to you from the mere fact of being with her and noticing what she did. You would have needed no help from any one else. But are you sure," she went on, after a little pause, "that you won't end by thinking me tiresome or interfering or worrisome if I do as I say?" "No, indeed I won't!" cried Candace, to whom this long talk had been like the clearing up after a thunder shower. "I think it would be too mean if I felt that way when you are so kind." Chapter 3. Little Country Girl by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Lynne Thompson. Chapter 3. A Walk on the Cliffs. It is always an odd, unhomelike moment when one wakes up for the first time in a new place. Sleep is a separation between us and all that has gone before it. It takes a little while to recollect where we are and how we came there, and to get used to the strangeness which had partly worn away, but has come on again while we dreamed and forgot all about it. Candace experienced this when she woke in the little blue room the morning after her arrival in Newport. She had gone to bed, by Mrs. Gray's advice, when their long talk about manners and customs was ended, and without going downstairs again. "You are very tired, I can see," said Cousin Kate. "A long night's sleep will freshen you, and the world will look differently and a great deal pleasanter to morrow." Candace was glad to follow this counsel. She was tired, and she felt shy of Mr. Gray and the girls, and would rather put off meeting them again, she thought, till the morning. 10 hours of unbroken sleep rested her thoroughly, but she woke with a feeling of puzzled surprise at her surroundings, and for a few moments could not gather up her thoughts or quite recollect where she was. Then it all came back to her, and she was again conscious of the uncomfortable sensations of the night before. She lay a little while thinking about it, and half wishing that she need not get up at all, but just burrow under the blanket and hide herself, like a mouse or rabbit in his downy hole, till everybody had forgotten her blunders, and till she herself could forget them. But she said to herself bravely, "I won't be foolish. Cousin Kate is just lovely. She's promised to help me, and I'm sure she will. I will try not to mind the others, but oh dear, I wish I were not so afraid of the girls." She jumped out of bed resolutely, and began to dress, taking her time about it, and stealing many glances out of the open window, for she knew it must be early, and as yet there were no sounds of life about the house. After her hair was curled, she stood for some time at the door of the closet, debating what dress she should put on. The choice was limited. There were only a brown plaided gingham, a blue calico, and a thick white cambric to choose from. The latter seemed to her almost too nice to be worn in the morning. It was the first white dress she had ever been allowed to have, and Aunt Myra had said a good deal about the difficulty of getting it done up. So it seemed to Candace rather a sacred garment, which should be reserved for special state occasions. After hesitating a while, she put on the brown gingham. It had a little ruffle basted round the neck. Candace tried the effect of a large blue bow, and then of a muslin one, very broad with worked ends, but neither pleased her exactly. She recollected that Georgie and Gertrude had worn simple little ruches the night before, with no bows, and at last she wisely decided to fasten her ruffle with the little bar of silver which was her sole possession by way of ornament, for her mother's few trinkets had all been sold during her father's long illness. This pin had been a present from the worldly minded Mrs. Buell, who so often furnished a text to Aunt Myra's homilies. She had one day heard Cannie say, when asked by one of the Buell daughters if she had any jewelry, "Are napkin rings jewelry? I've got a napkin ring." Mrs. Buell had laughed at the droll little speech, and repeated it as a good joke; but the next time she went to Hartford she bought the silver pin for Cannie, who was delighted, and held it as her choicest possession. Her dressing finished, Candace went softly downstairs. She paused at the staircase window to look out. Cousin Kate's storm had not come after all. The day was brilliantly fair. Long fingers of sunshine were feeling their way through the tree branches, seeking out shady corners, and giving caressing touches to all growing things. A book lay on the window bench. It was "A York and a Lancaster Rose," which little Marian had been reading the night before. It looked interesting, and seeing by a glance at the tall clock in the hall below that it was but a little after 7, Candace settled herself for a long, comfortable reading before breakfast. Mrs. Gray was the first of the family to appear. She swept rapidly downstairs in her pretty morning wrapper of pale silk, with a small muslin cap trimmed with ribbons of the same shade on her glossy black hair, and paused to give Cannie a rapid little kiss. But she looked preoccupied, and paid no further attention to her, beyond a kind word or two, till breakfast was over, the orders for the day given, half a dozen notes answered, and half a dozen persons seen on business. The girls seemed equally busy. Each had her own special little task to do. Georgie looked over the book tables and writing tables, sorted, tidied, put away the old newspapers, made sure that there was ink in the inkstands, and pens and paper in plenty. After this was done, she set to work to water the plant boxes and stands in the hall and on the piazza. Gertrude fell upon a large box of freshly cut flowers, and began to arrange them in various bowls and vases. Little Marian had 3 cages of birds to attend to, which, as she was very particular about their baths and behavior, took a long time. Candace alone had nothing to do, and sat by, feeling idle and left out among the rest. "I think I shall put you in charge of the piazza boxes," said Mrs. Gray, noticing her forlorn look as she came back from her interview with the fishmonger. "See, Cannie, the watering pot is kept here, and the faucet of cold water is just there in the pantry. Would you like to take them as a bit of daily regular work? They must be sprinkled every morning, and if the earth is dry they must be thoroughly watered, and all the seed pods and yellow leaves and dead flowers must be picked off. Do you feel as if you could do it?" "Oh, I should like to," said Cannie, brightening. "Very well. Georgie has plenty to attend to without them, I imagine. She will be glad to be helped. Georgie, Cannie has agreed to take the care of all the outside flower boxes in future. You needn't have them on your mind any more." "That's nice," said Georgie, good naturedly. "Then I will look after the plants in your balcony, mamma. Elizabeth doesn't half see to them." "Oh, mightn't I do those too?" urged Cannie. "I wish you would let me." "Well, you can if you like. They are all watered for to day, though. You needn't begin till to morrow." "That is just as well," said Mrs. Gray, "for now that I am through with the orders and the tradesmen, I want Cannie to come up to the morning room for a consultation. Georgie, you may come too. It's about your hair, Cannie. Those thick curls are very pretty, but they look a trifle old fashioned, and I should think must be rather hot, like a little warm shawl always on your shoulders all summer long." She stroked the curls with her soft hand as she spoke. "Should you dislike to have them knotted up, Cannie? You are quite old enough, I think." "No, I shouldn't dislike it, but I don't know how to do my hair any other way. I have always worn it like this." "We'll teach you," cried Georgie and Gertrude, who had joined them while her mother was speaking. "Let us have a council of 3 in the morning room, and see what is most becoming to her." So upstairs they went, and the girls pounced on Cannie, and put a towel over her shoulders, and brushed out her curls, and tried this way and that, while Mrs. Gray sat by and laughed. She would not interfere, though Cannie at times resisted, and declared that they were pulling her hair and hurting her dreadfully, for she was anxious that the cousins should grow intimate and familiar with each other. In fact, Cannie's shyness was quite shaken out of her for the moment, and before the experiments were ended, and it was decided that a little bang on the forehead, and what Marian called a curly knot behind, suited her best, she felt almost at home with Georgie and Gertrude. "There," said Georgie, sticking in a last hairpin, Come and see yourself, and if you don't confess that you are improved, you're a very ungrateful young person, and that is all I have to say." Candace scarcely knew her own face when she was led up to the looking glass. The light rings of hair lay very prettily on the forehead, the curly knot showed the shape of her small head, and it looked easy and natural, as if it was meant to be so. She smiled involuntarily. The girl in the glass smiled back. "Why, I look exactly like someone else, and not a bit like myself," she cried. "What would Aunt Myra say to me?" "I am going out to do some errands," said Mrs. Gray. "Will you come along, Cannie, and have a little drive?" Mrs. Gray's errands seemed to be principally on behalf of her young companion. First they stopped at Seabury's, and after Mrs. Gray had selected a pair of Newport ties for herself, she ordered a similar pair for Candace. Then she said that while Cannie's shoe was off she might as well try on some boots, and Cannie found herself being fitted with a slender, shapely pair of black kid, which were not only prettier but much more comfortable than the country-made ones, which had made her foot look so clumsy. And after that they stopped at a carpet and curtain place, where Cannie was much diverted at hearing the proprietor recommend tassels instead of plaited rings on certain holland shades, for the reason that a tassel had more poetry about it somehow. Then, after a brief pause to order strawberries and fresh lettuce, the carriage was ordered to a milliner's. "I want to get you a little hat of some sort," said Cousin Kate. "The one you wore yesterday is rather old for a girl of your age. I will retrim it some day, and it will do for picnics and sales, but you need more hats than one in this climate, which is fatal to ribbons and feathers, and takes the stiffness out of everything." So a big shady hat of dark red straw, with just a scarf of the same color twisted around the crown and a knowing little wing in front, was chosen. And then Mrs. Gray spied a smaller one of fine yellowish straw with a wreath of brown scented daisies, and having popped it on Cannie's head for one moment, liked the effect and ordered that too. Two new hats! It seemed to Cannie's modest ideas like the wildest extravagance, and after they returned to the coupé she found courage to say, "Cousin Kate, please, you mustn't buy me too many things." "No, dear, I won't. I'll be careful," replied Mrs. Gray, smiling. Then, seeing that Cannie was in earnest, she added more seriously, "My child, I've no wish to make you fine. I don't like finery for young girls, but one needs a good many things in a place like this, and I want to have you properly dressed in a simple way. It was agreed upon between Aunt Myra and myself that I should see to your summer wardrobe after you got here, because Newport is a better shopping place than North Tolland, and while we are about it we may as well get pretty things as ugly ones. It doesn't cost any more, and it is no more trouble, and I'm sure you like them better, don't you?" "Oh, yes, indeed," replied Cannie, quite relieved by this explanation. "I like pretty things ever so much, only I thought I was afraid—" She did not know how to finish her sentence. "You were afraid I was ruining myself?" asked her cousin, looking amused. "No, Cannie, I won't do that, I promise you. And, in return, you will please let me just settle about a few things quite necessary for you, just as I should for Georgie and Gertrude, and say no more about it. Ah, there is the old mill. You will like to see that. Stop a moment, John." The coupé stopped accordingly by a small open square planted with grass and a few trees, and intersected with paths. There was a music stand in the center, a statue on a pedestal, and close by them, rising from the greensward, appeared a small, curious structure of stone. It was a roofless circular tower supported on round arches, which made a series of openings about its base. Cannie had never heard of the stone mill before, and she listened eagerly while Mrs. Gray explained that it had stood there since the earliest days of the colony, that no one knew exactly how old it was, who built it, or for what purpose it was built, and that antiquarians were at variance upon these points, and had made all sorts of guesses about its origin. Some insisted that it was erected by the Norsemen, who were the first to discover New England shores long before the days of Columbus. Others supposed it to be a fragment of an ancient church. Others again, and Mrs. Gray supposed that these were probably nearest the truth, insisted that it was just what it seemed to be, a mill for grinding corn, and pointed out the fact that mills of very much the same shape still exist in old country neighborhoods in England. She also told Cannie that the mill used to be thickly overhung with ivies and Virginia creepers, and that it had never been so pretty and picturesque since the town authorities, under a mistaken apprehension that the roots of the vines were injuring the masonry, had torn them all away and left the ruin bare and unornamented as she now saw it. "Did you ever read Longfellow's 'Skeleton in Armor'?" she asked. When Cannie said no, she repeated part of the poem, and promised to find the rest for Cannie to read when they got home. Then they drove on, and Cannie's head was so full of Leif the son of Arnulf, the fearful guest, and the maiden whose heart under her loosened vest fluttered like doves in their nest frighted, that she could hardly bring herself back to real life, even when Cousin Kate stopped at a famous dress furnisher's in the Casino block and caused her to be measured for 2 dresses. One was of white woolen stuff, like those which Georgie and Gertrude had worn the night before; the other, a darker one, of cream and brown foulard, which Mrs. Gray explained would be nice for church and for driving and for cool days, of which there were always plenty in the Newport summer. She also bought a little brown parasol for Cannie, and a tightly fitting brown jacket to match the foulard, and altogether it was a most exciting and adventurous morning. Cannie, as she took off her hat at home and fluffed the newly constructed bang into shape with gentle finger touches, asked herself if it could be really only a day and a half since she had said good bye to Aunt Myra in North Tolland, and if in fact it were really herself, little Candace Arden, to whom these wonderful things belonged, or if it was someone else. Perhaps it was all a dream, and she should presently wake up. "If I be I, as I believe it be," was the tenor of her thought, as the old woman in the nursery rhyme. Only Cannie had no little dog at hand to help her to a realization of her own identity. Into Candace's bare little cradle in the hill country had been dropped one precious endowment. From both her father and her mother she inherited the love of reading. If old tales were true, and the gift conferring fairies really came to stand round a baby's bed, each with a present in her hand, I think out of all that they could bestow I should choose for any child in whom I was interested these 2 things: a quick sense of humor and a love for books. There is nothing so lasting or so satisfying. Riches may take wing, beauty fade, grace vanish into fat, a sweet voice become harsh, rheumatism may cripple the fingers which played or painted so deftly. With each and all these delightful things time may play sad tricks. But to life's end the power to see the droll side of events is an unfailing cheer, and so long as eyes and ears last, books furnish a world of interest and escape whose doors stand always open. Winds may blow and skies may rain, fortune may prove unkind, days may be lonely and evenings dull, but for the true lover of reading there is always at hand this great company of companions and friends, the wisest, the gentlest, the best, never too tired or too busy to talk with him, ready at all moments to give their thought, their teaching, to help, instruct, and entertain. They never disappoint. They have no moods or tempers. They are always at home, in all of which respects they differ from the rest of our acquaintance. If the man who invented sleep is to be blessed, thrice blessed is the man who invented printing. There were not many books in the old yellow farmhouse at North Tolland, but all that there were Cannie had read over and over again. Shakespeare she knew by heart, and Paradise Lost, and Young's Night Thoughts, and Pollock's Course of Time. She had dipped into her father's theological library, and managed to extract some food for her imagination, even from such dry bones as Paley's Evidences, and Edwards on the Will and the Affections. Any book was better than no book to her. Aunt Myra, who discouraged the practice of reading for girls, as unfitting them for any sort of useful work, used to declare that the very sight of a book made Cannie deaf and blind and dumb. "You might as well be Laura What's her name and have done with it," she would tell her. "Only I don't know where to look for a Dr. Howe or a Dr. Anybody who will come along and teach you to develop your faculties. I declare I believe you'd rather read a dictionary any day than not read at all." "I don't know but I would," said Cannie, but she said it to herself. She was rather afraid of Aunt Myra. With this strong love of reading the girl's delight may be imagined when Mrs. Gray, true to her promise, put into her hands a great illustrated volume of Longfellow, and left her free to dip and select and read as long as she chose. She curled herself up on the staircase bench, and was soon so deep in the skeleton in armour as to be quite oblivious to all that went on below. She did not hear the bell ring, she did not see various ladies shown into the drawing room, or notice the hum of conversation that followed. She never lifted her eyes when Georgie Gray and a friend, who was no other than the identical Miss Joy of the "Eolus," stood at the staircase foot for some moments and held a whispered conversation; nor was she conscious of the side glances which the visitor now and then cast up toward the brown gingham skirt visible above. It was not till "Skoal! To the Northland, skoal!" ended the poem that her dream ended, and she roused herself to find the callers gone and the luncheon on the table. Mrs. Gray was wont to say that they always had a meal at noon and a meal at night, and when her husband was at home, the first was called lunch and the second dinner, and when he was away the first was called dinner and the second supper, and that the principal difference between them was that at one there was soup and at the other there was not. Candace did not particularly care what the meal was called. Under any name she was glad of it, for sea air and a morning drive had made her very hungry. And this time she was on her guard, watched carefully what others did, and made no serious blunders. "What are you girls going to do this afternoon?" asked Mrs. Gray. "Berry Joy has asked me to drive with her," replied Georgie. "She wants to take her friend over to the Fort to hear the band play. You have no objection, have you, mamma?" "No, none at all. And you, Gertrude?" "I haven't made any particular plan." "Then suppose you and Candace take a walk on the cliffs. I have to take Marian to the dentist, but Cannie has not seen the sea yet, except at a distance, and you both ought to have a good exercise in the fresh air, for I am almost sure it will rain by to morrow. You might take her to the beach, Gertrude, and come home by Marine Avenue." "Very well, mamma, I will, certainly," said Gertrude, but there was a lack of heartiness in her tone. Like most very young girls, she had a strong sense of the observant eyes of Mrs. Grundy, and she did not at all approve of the brown gingham. "I wonder why mamma can't wait till she has made Cannie look like other people," she was saying to herself. There was no help for it, however. None of Mrs. Gray's children ever thought of disputing her arrangements for a moment, so the two girls set forth, Cannie in the despised gingham, and Gertrude in a closely fitting suit of blue serge, with a large hat of the same blue, which stood out like a frame round the delicate oval of her face, and set off the feathery light hair to perfection. Their way for a little distance was down a sort of country lane, which was the short cut to the cliffs. It ended in a smooth greensward at the top of a wall of broken rocks, and standing on the edge, Kenny called out, "Oh!" with a sense of sudden surprise and freedom. Before her was a bay of the softest blue, and here and there a line of white surf, where long rollers were sweeping in toward the distant beach. Opposite stretched a point of land rising into a low hill, which shone in the yellow afternoon sun, and from its end the unbroken sea stretched away into a lovely distance, whose color was like that of an opal, and which had no boundary but a mysterious dim line of faintly tinted sky. Sails shone out against the moving water, gulls were dipping and diving, a flock of wild ducks with glossy black heads swam a little way out from the shore. Beyond the point which made the other arm of the little bay rose an island, ramparted by rocks, over which the surf could be seen to break with an occasional toss of spray. There was a delicious smell of soft salty freshness, and something besides, a kind of perfume which Candace could not understand or name. "Oh, what is it? What can it be?" she said. "What?" "The smell. It is like flowers. Oh, there it is again." "Mamma makes believe that it is the Spice Islands," answered Gertrude indifferently, "or else Madeira. You know there is nothing between us and the coast of Africa except islands." "Really and truly? How wonderful!" "Well, I don't see how it is so very wonderful. It just happens so. I suppose there are plenty of seaside places where they can say the same thing." "Perhaps, but I never saw any sea coast but this. It is all new to me." "I suppose so," responded Gertrude with a little yawn. She looked to right and to left, fearing that some acquaintance might be coming to see her in company with this rather shabby little companion. "Would you like to walk up the cliff a little way, or shall we go down to the beach?" she asked. "Oh, let us just go as far as that point," said Candace, indicating where to the right, past a turnstile, A smooth gravel path wound its way between the beautifully kept borders of grass. The path ran on the very edge of the cliff, and the outer turf dipped at a steep incline to where the sharp rock ran down perpendicularly, but to the very verge it was fine and as perfectly cut as anywhere else. Candace wondered who held the gardeners, and kept them safe while they shaved the grass so smoothly in this dangerous spot, but she did not like to ask. Gertrude's indifferent manner drove her in upon herself and made her shy. 100 feet and more below them the sea was washing into innumerable rocky fissures, with a hollow, booming sound. The cliff line was broken into all sorts of bold forms, buttresses and parapets and sharp inclines, and here and there a shallow cave or a bit of shingly beach. Every moment the color of the water seemed to change, and the soft duns and purples of the horizon line to grow more intense. Candace had no eyes but for the sea. She scarcely noticed the handsome houses on her right hand, each standing in its wide lawn, with shrubberies and beds of dazzling flowers. Gertrude, on the contrary, scarcely looked at the sea. It was an old story to her, and she was much more interested in trying to make out people she knew at the windows of the houses they passed, or on their piazzas, and in speculating about the carriages which could be seen moving on the distant road. "How good it is of the people who own the places to let everybody go through them!" exclaimed Candace, when it was explained to her that the Cliff Walk was a public one. "Oh, they can't help themselves. There is a right of way all round the island, and nobody will be allowed to close it. Some owners grumble and don't like it a bit, but mamma says it is one of the best things in Newport, and that it would be a great injury to the place to have it taken away. The Cliff Walk is very celebrated, you know. Lots of people have written things about it." "Oh, I should think they would. It is the most beautiful place I ever saw." "You haven't seen many places, have you?" observed Gertrude, rather impolitely. "Oh, no, I never saw anything but North Tolland till I came to Newport." "Then you can't judge." They had now turned and were walking eastward toward the beach. Its line of breaking surf could be distinctly seen now. Carriages and people on horseback were driving or riding along the sands, and groups of black dots were discernible which were other people on foot. "There is Pulpit Rock," said Gertrude, stopping where a shelving path slanted down toward a great square mass of stone, which was surrounded on 3 sides by water. "Would you like to go down and sit on top for a little while? I am rather tired." "Oh, I should like to so much." Down they scrambled accordingly, and in another moment were on top of the big rock. It was almost as good as being at sea, for when they turned their backs to the shore nothing could be seen but water and sails and flying birds, and nothing heard but the incessant plash and dash of the waves below. "Oh, how perfectly splendid!" cried Cannie. "I should think you would want to come here every day, Gertrude." "Yes, that's always what people say when they first come," said the experienced Gertrude; "but I assure you we don't come every day, and we don't want to. Why, sometimes last summer I didn't see the Cliffs for weeks and weeks together. It's nice enough now when there are not many people here, but after the season begins and the crowd, it isn't nice at all. You see all sorts of people that you don't know, and, well, it isn't pleasant." "I can't think what you mean," declared Cannie, opening her eyes with amazement. "I'd just as soon sit there with 20 people on this rock, if I needn't look at them and they didn't talk to me. The sea would be just the same." "You'll feel differently when you've been in Newport a while. It's not at all the fashion to walk on the cliffs now except on Sunday, and not at this end of them even then. A great many people won't bathe either. They say it has grown so common. Why, it used to be the thing to walk down here. All the nicest people did it, and now you never see anybody below Narragansett Avenue, except the ladies' maids and butlers, and people who are boarding at the hotels and don't know any better." "How funny it seems," remarked Candace, half to herself, with her eyes on the distance, which was rapidly closing in with mist. "What is funny?" "Oh, I was only thinking how funny it is there should be a fashion about coming down to such a beautiful place as this." "I don't see how it is funny." "Yes," persisted Candace, who, for all her shyness, had ideas and opinions of her own, "because the Cliffs are so old and have always been here, and I suppose some of the people who make it the fashion not to walk upon them have only just come to Newport." "I really think you are the queerest girl I ever saw," said Gertrude. A long silence ensued. Each of the two girls was thinking her own thoughts. The thickening on the horizon, meanwhile, was increasing. Thin films of vapor began to blow across the sky. The wind stirred and grew chill. The surf on the beach broke with a low roar which had a menacing sound. Suddenly a wall of mist rose and rolled rapidly inland, blotting out all the blue and the smile of sky and sea. "Gracious, here's the fog," said Gertrude, "and I do believe it's going to rain. We must hurry home. I rather think mamma's storm is coming, after all." Chapter 4 of A Little Country Girl by Susan Coolidge. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Chapter 4 The Manual of Perfect Gentility. Mrs. Gray's storm had indeed come. All the next day it rained, and the day after it rained harder, and on the third day came a thick fog, so it was not till the very end of the week that Newport lay again in clear sunshine. The first of the wet days Cannie spent happily in the society of Miss Evangeline and Mr. Hiawatha, two new acquaintances of whom she felt that she could scarcely see enough. Marian found her sitting absorbed on the staircase bench, and after peeping over her shoulder at the pictures for a while, begged her to read aloud. It was the first little bit of familiar acquaintance which any of the younger members of the Gray family had volunteered, and Candace was much pleased. Marian was not yet 14, and was still very much of a child at heart and in her ways. Her capable little face did not belie her character. She was a born housekeeper, always tidying up and putting away after other people. Everything she attempted she did exactly and well. She was never so happy as when she was allowed to go into the kitchen to make molasses candy or try her hand at a cake, and her cake was almost always good, and her candy pulled to admiration. She was an affectionate child with a quick sense of fun and a droll little coaxing manner, which usually won for her her own way, especially from her father, who delighted in her and never could resist Marian's saucy, caressing appeals. It required all Mrs. Gray's firm, judicious discipline to keep her from being spoiled. Georgie, who was nearly 19, seemed younger in some respects than Gertrude, who was but 3 months older than Candace. Georgie, too, had a good deal of the housekeeper's instinct, but she was rather dreamy and puzzle-headed, and with the best intentions in the world was often led into scrapes and difficulties from her lack of self-reliance, and the easy temper which enabled anyone who was much with her to gain an influence over her mind. But it is less easy to tell what Gertrude was. In fact, it was less important just then to find out what she was than what she was likely to be. Gertrude reminded one of an unripe fruit. The capacities for sweetness and delightfulness were there within her, but all in a crude, undeveloped state. No one could predict as yet whether she would ripen and become mellow and pleasant with time, or remain always half hard and half sour, as some fruits do. Meanwhile she was the prettiest, though not the most popular, of the Gray sisters, and she ruled over Georgie's opinions and ideas with the power which a stronger and more selfish character always has over a weaker and more pliable one. Marian was less easily influenced. She and Gertrude often came into collision, and it was in part the habit of disputing Gertrude's mandates which led her to seek out Candace on that rainy afternoon. In the privacy of her own room that morning, Gertrude had made some very unflattering remarks about their newly arrived relative. "It's really quite dreadful to have a girl like that come to spend the whole summer with one," she said to Georgie. "She hasn't a bit of style, and her clothes are so queer and old-timey, and she's always lived up on that horrid farm, and hasn't an idea beyond it. Everything surprises her so, and she makes such a fuss over it. You should have heard her yesterday when we were out walking. She said the Cliffs had been there always, and some of the fashionable people had only just come." What did she mean? I'm sure I don't know. She says the queerest things, and she looks so funny and so different from the other girls, and of course everybody will know that she is our cousin." "Mamma has ordered her some dresses from Hollander's," observed Georgie, "and that was a real pretty hat that came home last night." "I don't care. They won't look like anything when she puts them on." "Gertrude Gray, I think it's real mean to talk so about your cousin," said Marian, who, with the instinct of a true little picture, had heard every word. "It isn't Cannie's fault that she has always lived on a farm. She didn't have anywhere else to live. Very likely she would have preferred Paris," with fine scorn, "or to go to boarding school in Dresden, as you and Georgie did, if anybody had given her the choice. She's real nice, I think, and now that her hair is put up, she's pretty too, a great deal prettier than some of the girls you like. I'm going down now to sit with her. You and Georgie don't treat her kindly a bit. You leave her all alone, and very likely she's homesick at this moment, but I shall be nice to her, whatever you do." Whereupon Miss Marian marched out of the room with her nose in the air, and devoted herself to Candace for the rest of the day, much to the lonely little visitor's contentment. They grew quite at home with each other over Evangeline. Birthday books had just come into fashion. Somebody had given Marian one, and she now brought it, and asked Candace to write in it. "June 17th," she said, as Cannie sought out the right page. "Why, that is next Saturday." "So it is, though I shouldn't have remembered it if it hadn't been for your book." "Why, how funny!" said Marian, opening her eyes wide. "Don't you keep your birthdays?" "Keep them?" repeated Candace in a tone of perplexity. "Yes, keep, celebrate them. Don't people ever give you presents? Didn't you ever have a cake?" her voice increasing in dismay, as Candace, in answer to each question, shook her head. "Cake? On my birthday, you mean? No, I don't think I ever did. Aunt Myra doesn't believe in cake. She says she liked it when she was young, but since she was converted to cracked wheat and oatmeal at the age of 33, she has hardly ever touched it. We never had any at North Tolland, except gingerbread sometimes." "What a dreadful kind of aunt for a girl to have," remarked Marian, meditatively. She sat for some time longer on the floor, with her head on Candace's knee, but she seemed to be thinking deeply about something, and said she didn't feel like being read to any longer. At last she went away to speak to mamma, she said. Candace had forgotten all about this birthday discussion before Saturday morning dawned dimly out of the still persistent fog. All the time she was dressing, her eyes were on the golden legend, which lay open on the bureau beside her, and her thoughts were so much occupied with Prince Henry and poor pretty Elsie, for whom she felt so very sorry, that she had none to spare for the comparatively unimportant fact that she, little Candace Arden, had that day turned the corner of her 17th year. It was all the more a delightful surprise, therefore, when she went down to breakfast and found a pile of dainty white ribbon-tied parcels on her plate, a glass of beautiful roses beside it, and was met with a special kiss from Cousin Kate, and a chorus of "Many happy returns" from the rest of the family. The little softnesses and prettinesses of life, the gifts and surprises, the sweet words, the being made much of on special occasions, were quite unknown to the old farmhouse in North Tolland. Aunt Myra was a stanch Presbyterian. She disapproved on principle of Christmas Day, as belonging to popery and old superstition. She didn't see that one day was any better than any other day. It was just an accident on what day of the year you were born, and it was no use to make a fuss about it, she said. There were plenty of people in the world before you came, and there would have been plenty if you had never come at all. Such was Aunt Myra's dictum. With these views, it may be supposed that Candace's idea of an anniversary was not a very lively one. For a moment she scarcely took in the meaning of what she saw, but stood regarding the plateful of parcels with a bewildered look on her face. "It's your birthday, you know," exclaimed little Marian. "Many happy returns. Don't you recollect that it's your birthday? We shouldn't have found it out, though, if it hadn't been for my book." "I'm not so sure about that," said Mrs. Gray, smiling at her. I had the date of Cannie's birthday put down securely somewhere, and I've been keeping a special gift for it. It's something that I brought you from Geneva, Cannie, but as it had waited so long before getting to you, I thought it might as well wait a little longer and come on your anniversary." "Oh, thank you," said Candace, glancing shyly at the parcels. "Please do begin to open them," urged Marian. "It is such fun to see people open presents. That's mamma's. Open it first." It was a flat, squarish bundle, tied with a rose-colored ribbon. Cannie's fingers shook with excitement as she undid the knot. Breakfast, meantime, was at a standstill. The girls were peeping over her shoulders, Mr. Gray watching from behind his newspaper. Even Frederick, with a plate of hot toast in his hand, had paused, and out of one discreet eye was observing her movements. Inside was a flat case of gray polished wood, with a little silver ornament in the middle. It opened with a snap. Cannie pressed the spring, the lid flew up, and there, on a cushion of blue velvet, lay the prettiest little Swiss watch imaginable, with C.V.A. enameled on its lid. There was a slender gold chain attached, a little enameled key. Nothing could be more complete. "A watch! For me! To be my own!" cried Candace, hardly able to believe her eyes. "I never thought I should have a watch, and such a darling beauty as this. Oh, Cousin Kate!" "I am glad it pleases you," said her cousin, with another kiss. "You should have had it 2 years ago, but I thought you rather young to be trusted with a watch then, so I kept it till we should meet." "Oh, do make haste and open another. It's such fun to see you," pleaded Marian. One by one the other parcels were unfastened. There was a little ring of twisted gold from Georgie, a sachet of braided ribbons, dark and light blue, from Gertrude, a slender silver bangle from Marian, and from Mr. Gray a long roll of tissue paper in which lay 6 pairs of undressed kid gloves in pretty shades of tan color and pale yellow. There was besides a big box of candy. This, Mr. Gray declared, was his real present. Cousin Kate was responsible for the gloves, but he knew very well that there never yet was a girl of 17 who did not have a sweet tooth ready for a sugar plum. One bundle remained. It was tied with pink packthread instead of ribbon. Cannie undid the string. It was a book, not new, bound in faded brown, and the title printed on the back was "The Lady's Manual of Perfect Gentility." "Who on earth gave you that?" demanded Marian. Mrs. Gray looked surprised, and not very well pleased. "It's a joke, I suppose," she said. "Georgie, Gertrude, which of you has been amusing yourself in this odd way?" "Not I, mamma," said Georgie. Gertrude felt the reproof in her mother's manner, but she tried to laugh the matter off. "Oh, I put it there just for fun," she said. "I thought the more parcels the better, and I happened to see that queer old thing, and thought it would make Cannie laugh." This explanation was not quite sincere. Gertrude had put the book on the table, hoping to tease Cannie. She had overheard something which her mother was telling Candace the day before, an explanation about some little point of manners, and it had suggested the idea of the old volume. Her shaft had missed its mark somehow, or, like the boomerangs used by the Australian blacks, had returned again to the hand that aimed it, for Cannie did not seem to mind at all, and Mrs. Gray, though she said no more at the moment, was evidently meditating a lecture. It came after breakfast, and was unexpectedly severe, hurting Gertrude a great deal more than her maliciously intended gift had hurt Candace. "You are inclined to despise your cousin as countrified and unused to society," said Mrs. Gray. "I grant that she is not up in all the little social rules, but let me tell you, Gertrude, that Cannie has the true instinct of ladyhood in her, and after the occurrence of this morning I am beginning to fear that you have not. Good manners are based on good feeling. Cannie may be shy and awkward. She may not know how to face a roomful of strangers gracefully. Such things are not hard to learn, and she will learn them in time. But of one thing I am very sure, and that is that if you were her guest at North Tolland instead of her being yours at Newport, she would be quite incapable of any rudeness, however slight, or of trying to make you uncomfortable in any way. I wish I could say the same of you, Gertrude. I am disappointed in you, my child." "Oh, mamma, don't speak so!" cried Gertrude, almost ready to cry, for she admired her mother as well as loved her, and was cravingly desirous to win her good opinion. "Please don't think I meant to be rude. It really and truly was a joke." "My dear, you meant a little more by it than that," replied Mrs. Gray, fixing her soft, penetrating look on Gertrude's face. "You haven't begun quite rightly with Candace. I have noticed it, and have been sorry. Sorry for you even more than for her. She is an affectionate, true hearted girl. You can make a good friend of her if you will, and you can be of use to her and she to you." Now what did mamma mean by that? thought Gertrude, after she had gone upstairs. I can't for the life of me see what use Cannie could be to me. I might help her, perhaps, if I wanted to. The Manual of Perfect Gentility was destined to excite more attention than its donor had intended, in more ways than one. Candace and Marian fell to reading it, and found its contents so amusing that they carried it to the morning room, where Georgie was taking a lesson in china painting from her mother, who was very clever at all the minor art accomplishments. Gertrude came in at the same time, in search of some crewels to match an embroidery pattern, so they were all together. "Mamma, mamma, please listen to this," cried Marian, as she read. "Directions for entering the room at an evening party. Fix your eye on the lady of the house on entering, and advance toward her with outstretched hand, neither looking to the right nor to the left, until you have interchanged the ordinary salutations of the occasion. When this is done, turn aside and mingle with the other guests." Now, mamma, just imagine it, marching in with your hand out and your eye fixed! And Marian, relinquishing the manual to Cannie, flew to the door and entered in the manner prescribed, with her eyes set in a stony glare on her mother's face, and her hand held before her as stiffly as if it had been a shingle. No one could help laughing. "I don't think the hand and the glare are necessary," said Mrs. Gray, "but it is certainly quite proper to speak to the lady of the house, when you come in, before you begin to talk to other people." "Here's another," cried Marian, hardly waiting till her mother had done speaking. "Just listen to these. Directions for a horseback ride. Mounting. The lady should stand on the left side of the horse with her right hand on the pommel of her saddle, and rest her foot lightly on the shoulder of her gentleman attendant, who bends before her. When this is done, the gentleman will slowly raise himself to the perpendicular position, and in doing so lift the lady without difficulty to the level of her seat." "My gracious! Suppose he didn't?" remarked Georgie, looking up from her painting. "There she would be, standing on his shoulder on one foot. Imagine it! On the avenue!" And the four girls united in a peal of laughter. "But there is something here that I really want to know about," said Candace. "May I read it to you, Cousin Kate? It's in a chapter called Correspondence." "Oh, my!" cried Marian, who still held fast to one side of the manual. "It tells how to refuse gentlemen when they offer themselves to you. Here it all is. You must say, 'Sir, I regret extremely if anything in my manner has led you to misapprehension of my true feelings. I do not experience for you the affection which alone can make the marriage relation a happy one. So I—'" "No, no," interrupted Candace, blushing very pink, and pulling the book away from Marian. "That isn't at all what I wanted to ask you about, Cousin Kate. It was—" "Oh, then perhaps you meant to accept him," went on the incorrigible Marian, again getting possession of one side of the Manual of Gentility. "Here you are. 'Dear friend, your letter has made me truly happy, breathing, as it does, expressions of deep and heartfelt affection, of which I have long felt the corresponding sentiments. I shall be happy to receive you in my home as an accepted suitor, and I—'" "Cousin Kate, make her stop. Isn't she too bad?" said Cannie, vainly struggling for the possession of the book. "And I—let me see, where was I when you interrupted?" went on Marian. "Oh, yes, here. 'And I am sure that my parents will give their hearty consent to our union. Receive my thanks for your assurances, and believe—'" But Candace had again got hold of the volume, and no one ever learned the end of the letter, or what the lover of this obliging lady was to believe. "This is what I wanted to ask you about, Cousin Kate," said Candace, when quiet was restored. "The book says, The signature of a letter should depend upon the degree of familiarity existing between the writer and the person addressed. For instance, in writing to a perfect stranger, a lady would naturally use the form, "Yours truly, Mrs. A.M. Cotterell." "Oh," interrupted Georgie. "Fancy anyone signing herself 'Yours truly, Mrs. A.M. Cotterell.' It's awfully vulgar, isn't it, mamma?" "That is a very old fashioned book," observed Mrs. Gray. "Still, I don't think, even at the time when it was published, that well bred people used a signature like that. It may not be awfully vulgar, but it certainly is not correct. Nothing but the Christian name should ever be used as a signature." "But suppose the person you were writing to did not know whether you were married or not," said Candace. "Then you can add your address below, like this," and she wrote on the edge of her drawing paper, "Yours truly, Catherine V. Gray, Mrs. Courtney Gray, Newport, Rhode Island." "That is what I should do if I were writing to a stranger." "Then there is this about the addresses of letters," went on Candace. "In addressing a married lady, use her maiden as well as her married name. For example, in writing to Miss Sarah J. Beebe, who is married to George Gordon, the proper direction would be 'Mrs. Sarah B. Gordon, care of George Gordon, Oshkosh, Michigan.' Is that right, Cousin Kate?" "No, that is decidedly wrong. When Miss Beebe married, she became not only Mrs. Gordon, but Mrs. George Gordon, to distinguish her from any other Mrs. Gordons who might happen to exist. She should sign herself Sarah B. Gordon, but her letters and cards should bear her married name, Mrs. George Gordon." "But people do write to widows in that way, don't they?" asked Gertrude. "I recollect, when I went to the post office with Berry Joy one day, there was a letter for her mother, directed to Mrs. Louisa Bailey Joy." "Yes, people do, but not the people who know the right way," her mother replied dryly. "A man's Christian name doesn't die with him, any more than his surname. I often see letters addressed to Mrs. Jane this and Mrs. Maria that, but it never seems to me either correct or elegant. It is purely American custom. English people have never adopted it, and it seems very odd to them." "Well, about cards," continued Marian, who was turning over the leaves of the Manual of Gentility. "See what a funny little card this is, and the writer of the book says it is the kind we ought to have." She pointed to a page on which appeared a little oblong enclosure bearing the name Fanny C. Jones. "That isn't nice a bit, is it, mamma?" "No, I confess that it does not look to me at all right. Girls old enough to need cards are old enough to have handles to their names. If I were that young woman, I should spell Fanny without the IE, and call myself Miss Frances C. Jones on my card, and keep my pet name for the use of my friends, and not print it." "I think I've learned a good deal to day," said Candace. "The funny old book isn't right in what it says, but Cousin Kate knows, so it comes to the same thing in the end. I'm glad you gave it to me, Gertrude." Gertrude had the grace to feel ashamed, as she saw Candace's perfect freedom from shame. "Oh dear, how much there is to learn!" continued Candace, with a sigh. She was still deep in the Ladies' Manual of Perfect Gentility. "Put away that book, Cannie," said her cousin, "or give it to me, and I will hide it where Gertrude shall not find it again. Good breeding can be learned without printed rules." "Can it, mamma?" "Yes, for, as I was trying to say this morning to Gertrude, good manners are the result of good feeling. If we really care about other people, and want to make them happy, and think of them and not of ourselves, we shall instinctively do what will seem pleasant to them, and avoid doing what is disagreeable. We shall refrain from interrupting them when they are speaking. We shall not half listen to what they say, while our eyes are roving about the room, and our attention wandering to other things. We shall be quick to notice if they want anything that we can get for them. We shall not answer at random, or giggle, or say the wrong thing. We shall not loll back in our chairs, as Georgie is doing at this moment, with one foot cocked over the other knee, and a paint brush in our mouths." "Mamma!" And Georgie hastily recovered the upright position, and took her paint brush from between her lips. "We shall not drum idly on window panes, as Gertrude was doing just now, for fear that the little noise will be disagreeable to our neighbors." "Now, mamma!" We shall not walk carelessly between anyone and the fire, because we shall be afraid of making them cold, nor shall we upset a work basket while doing so, as Marian upset mine just now. Mamma, I do believe you are giving us all a scolding. I shall just stop you," and Marian flung her arms round her mother's neck, and gave her half a dozen enormous kisses. "We shall consider a kiss as a favor," went on Mrs. Gray, inexorably, holding Marian off at arm's length, "not a punishment to be inflicted whenever we happen to feel like it. We shall never trot one foot when we are nervous, and shake the table." "Cannie, that's you. I thought it would be your turn soon," said Marian. "Oh, did I trot?" said Cannie. "Please excuse me, Cousin Kate. I have such a bad habit of doing that. Aunt Myra says it's my safety valve." "If it's a safety valve, it's all very well," replied her cousin. "I don't know. In short, my dears, as the poet says, 'Manners are not idle, but the fruit of noble nature and of lofty mind.' The instinct of self-control, of gentleness, of consideration and forethought and quick sympathy, which go to make up what we call good breeding, the absence of noise and hurry, the thousand and one little ways by which we can please people or avoid displeasing them, are all taught us by our own hearts. Good manners are the fine flower of civilization, and everybody can have them. I always say that one of the best bred men of my acquaintance is Mr. Jarvis, the mason. I have known him come up out of a cistern to speak to me, dressed in overalls and a flannel shirt, and his bow and his manner, and the politeness of his address, would have done credit to any gentleman in the world." "Mamma, how funny you are!" said Georgie, wonderingly; but Gertrude caught her mother's meaning more clearly. "I rather like it," she said slowly. "It sounds like something in a poem or a story book, and it would be nice if everybody felt like that, but people don't. I've heard Mrs. Joy speak quite rudely to Mr. Jarvis, mamma." "Very likely. I never have considered Mrs. Joy as a model of manners," replied Mrs. Gray, coolly. "And that reminds me to say just one other word about good breeding towards servants and people who work for us, or are poor and need our help. Gentleness and politeness are even more important with them than they are with other people." "Why more, mamma?" "Because their lives are harder than ours, and we owe them all the little help that courtesy can give. Because, too, we are their models, consciously or unconsciously, and if we are polite to them, they will in return be polite to us. And besides, they meet us at a disadvantage. If a servant answers back, she is called impertinent and discharged. But I should think it must be rather hard not to answer back to some mistresses." "Is that why you are always so very polite to Jane?" asked Gertrude. Jane was the cook. "Yes, partly that, and partly because I want Jane to be very polite to me, and she always is." "There is the sun at last, I do declare!" cried Marian, springing up. "Hurrah! I should think it was time. Now we shall have some nice weather, Cannie. Newport is lovely after a fog. It looks so nicely washed, and so green. Mamma, couldn't we have a long drive this afternoon in the wagonette, across the beaches, and way round by the windmill? I like that drive so much." "Yes, and at dinner we will eat Cannie's health in her birthday cake. It is making now, and Jane has the 17 little pink candles all ready. How the fog is rolling away! It will be a charming afternoon." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of A Little Country Girl by Susan Coolidge. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Chapter 5. Down to Beaver Tail. Sunday morning brought the fresh, lovely stillness which Sundays in early summer seem always to possess in Newport. Later in the season the roll of wheels and the jingle of plaited harnesses come to mar this peacefulness, but till the very end of June it endures, and is one of the sweet things of the place. The Joys were at breakfast. It was one of the points in which Mrs. Joy took most pride, that this meal was served in a special apartment known as the breakfast room, and not, as with most families, in the room where they dined. The breakfast room was not large, but sumptuous in all its appointments. The critical taste might have objected that the plush curtains which shaded the windows were too heavy for summer, that the begilded wall-paper swore a little at its own dado and frieze, as well as deadened the effect of the pictures which hung against it, and that the drapery of lace and velvet which veiled the fireplace made a fire inconvenient and almost impossible, however cold the weather might be. But a critical taste might have found the same faults with the whole house. The general effect was of costliness and magnificence, but the details were at variance, and comfort and homelikeness had been sacrificed in the effort to make everything fine. There was a library, with almost no books in it, a ballroom, which was used only for balls, and looked bare and shut up on ordinary days, a huge drawing-room, full of costly toys, tables loaded with Sèvres cups, other tables with possessions of pug-dogs in precious china, snuff-boxes, patch-boxes, chimney-piece crowded with porcelain figures and bits of old Dresden ware. There was a great deal of carving and ormolu, but it had the air of being created and kept for company use, and deserted the moment company went away. Mrs. Joy had only got so far in her art education as this, that she bought everything which cost a great deal of money, and which her neighbours bought, and she never stopped to reason about such minor points as taste, fitness, convenience, or the adaptation of an article to her own particular needs. Mrs. Joy was the very image of a prosperous woman, as she sat behind her heavy silver coffee-pots and cream-jugs, reading the Sunday paper, to get which her groom had ridden a couple of miles before breakfast. Her very black hair was trained into a line of formal rings across her forehead, which as yet scarcely showed a wrinkle. Her tightly laced figure was almost as slender as her daughter's, and the hand sparkling with diamonds which held the paper was white and youthful. Handsome she certainly was, and people called her agreeable, for she talked a great deal in a noisy, lively way, and had a caressing manner for all persons whom she thought it worth her while to caress. But her face was hard, and when the society smile died out of it, it was neither intelligent nor kindly. Mrs. Joy had been extremely pretty in her youth. Berenice was like her, but Tom Joy, the son, resembled his father, who had died 3 or 4 years before the opening of this little story. Berry and her friend Ethel Curtis were talking about a sailing party which they had planned for the next day. The Greys and the Hallets and Julia Prime, that makes 7. Mamma for matron, 8. Then there's Tom and George Rivington, and the 2 Fosters. I can't think where we are to get the other 3 men. It isn't like a dinner party. The numbers need not be exactly equal, suggested Ethel. That's true, but it's a great deal better fun to have them equal. Men hate to talk to 2 girls at once, and the girls who haven't any men to talk to feel left out. Carol Benton is coming up the end of the week. I wish he were here now. I guess you'd better look up some other matron and let me off, said Mrs. Joy, laying down her newspaper. I don't care much for sailing. I'm so apt to feel a little sick, and that spoils all the pleasure of it. Ask Mrs. Freddie Allen. She is young and likes to go everywhere, and Freddie will go along and make another gentleman. That will do nicely if you really don't want to go, mamma. We'll invite them all as we come out of church, and save the bother of writing notes. It's easier to explain when you see people than to write down everything. Yes, that's one of the conveniences of going to church, remarked Mrs. Joy, calmly. I've often had as many as 3 or 4 invitations coming out of Trinity on a Sunday morning in the season. These muffins are horrid. James, tell the cook she ought to be ashamed of herself to send up such things. They're as tough as leather, and burned besides. As black as my shoe, I do declare. Yes'm. And James departed to incense the cook with the unsoftened message. The cook declared that when ladies came down an hour late for breakfast, they must expect tough muffins, and for her part she didn't care whether they were good or not. She didn't think much of the place anyway, and didn't mean to stay on. There'd be plenty of people coming in a week or 2, and plenty of places to pick and choose from. Mrs. Joy was always having little difficulties with her servants. Trinity Church looked cool and shady as the party entered it from the dazzle of the outdoor sunshine. Berenice Joy was perfectly well trained in the outward forms of devotion. She called herself High Church, and nothing could be more graceful than the manner in which she glided up the aisle, bowed to the chancel, and sank on her knees for what was supposed to be a short interval of silent prayer. But her eyes went straight to the Greys' pew the moment she rose, and from thence to the Hallets, and she whispered to Ethel, "They're all here. That's nice." Then she indulged in a long stare at Candace, who had come to church with her cousins, and who, in her new cream and brown foulard, with the daisy-trimmed hat, and a pair of the birthday gloves on her slender hands, looked quite differently from the ill-dressed little passenger of the "Eolus" the Monday before. "Do look! That's the very girl we saw on the boat," went on Berenice, in the same low whisper. "Did you ever? Hasn't Mrs. Gray done her over nicely? I wonder where she got that hat." "I wonder what she has done with the old one." "Given it to the cook, or sold it to the rag and bottle man," retorted Berry. Then came a suppressed giggle, which ended in sudden forced gravity as the opening words of the service fell on their ears, and they rose with the rest of the congregation. Candace was not conscious that she was being looked at. She had only once or twice in her life been in an Episcopal church, and never before in an old one. Trinity seemed to her as wonderful and picturesque as some of the churches she had read about in books. She looked at the square pews where people sat sideways, instead of fronting the chancel as in ordinary churches. She noted the tall wands with gilded tops, which marked the places of the junior and senior wardens, the quaint swinging chandeliers of old brass, the tablets on the walls, 2 or 3 bearing inscriptions in honor of dead rectors or other departed worthies, one to the memory of a young girl with a beautiful flying figure in bas relief, carved in white marble. She gazed with amazement at the pulpit, one of the ancient 3-decker pattern, which is rarely seen nowadays, with a clerk's desk below, a reading desk above that a lofty pulpit for the clergyman, to which a narrow flight of stairs gave access, and suspended over all an enormous extinguisher-shaped sounding-board. It looked large and heavy enough to crush any clergyman who should be caught by its fall while in the act of preaching, and Candace watched its slight oscillations with apprehensive fascination, till she recollected that it must have hung there for 100 years at least, and there was no reason to suppose that it would drop on this particular Sunday. By turning her head a very little, she could get a glimpse of the organ loft, with its quaint little organ bearing 2 gilded mitres and a royal crown on top, and below, the inscription, "The gift of George Berkeley, late Lord Bishop of Cloyne." She wondered who George Berkeley could have been, and resolved to ask Cousin Kate, as they went home, if there was any story about him. There was no whispering or giggling in Mrs. Gray's pew. The girls were too well trained for such irreverence, and except that Georgie interchanged one little smile with Berry Joy as she came in, not one of them looked away from the clergyman till the sermon was over and the benediction pronounced. It had been an impressive service to Candace, who was used to the barer forms of the Congregational church, and she was surprised to perceive how little solemnizing effect it seemed to have on the congregation in general. The moment people rose from their knees, a low buzz of conversation began. Berry Joy seized on Georgie and Gertrude, and began to unfold the sailing plan as they walked down the aisle. Mrs. Joy took possession of Cousin Kate. Everybody seemed to have something to say to somebody. Candace caught scraps of half a dozen different conversations before she reached the door, and not one of them related in any way to the sermon or to anything religious. She overheard one invitation to dinner, another to drive, an inquiry about a dressmaker, a bit of gossip about a new engagement, a request for a recipe for mayonnaise. She supposed it must be the right thing to chatter thus, since all the delightful-looking people did it. Still, it seemed to her country notions rather queer. The carriage was waiting in Spring Street, a little farther up the hill. She did not like to get in till the others were ready, so she stepped aside among the gravestones and looked up to where the white, slender spire of the old church towered against the blue. She was trying to make out the Episcopal mitre surmounted by the gilded weather vane, when Mrs. Gray saw and beckoned to her. She was still talking with Mrs. Joy, and that lady was saying, "I may possibly not be able to go myself, but if I am prevented, I will see that the young folks have a proper matron. And then, my dear, there's Captain Davis, you know. I never let Berry sail with anyone else. He's so safe and so careful, and the weather promises to be perfect." "It certainly is perfect to day," said Mrs. Gray. "Candace, dear, I want to introduce you to Mrs. Joy. My cousin, Miss Arden, Mrs. Joy, or rather my niece, for her mother was like my own sister. She has come to spend the summer with me. Cannie, Mrs. Joy is the mother of the young lady who came down with you on the Eolus." "Ah, indeed, the girls did not tell me about that," said Mrs. Joy. "Well, my dear," Mrs. Joy would have said my dear to Queen Victoria or to the Empress of China, if she had ever had the chance of an interview with those potentates, "you've come to a charming place and to charming relatives, I'm sure, and you can't fail to enjoy your summer. You must come with your cousins to morrow to this sailing party which my young folks are getting up. They'll be delighted, I'm sure." "Thank you," said Candace timidly, glancing at Mrs. Gray. "That will be very nice," said her cousin. "Cannie has not been on the water yet. It is a new pleasure for her. At 4 o'clock, you said, Mrs. Joy?" "Yes, dear, at 4. And don't trouble to send down for the girls. It's impossible to tell exactly when they will get in, as it depends on the wind, and Berry will have the beach wagon, and can bring them all up as well as not. Good bye, dear." And Mrs. Joy sailed toward her carriage, where the two girls were already seated. "I've asked Miss Arden, who's staying with the Grays, to go out sailing with you tomorrow," she said, as she took her seat. "You'll want another gentleman, Berry." "Oh, mamma, what did you do that for? She's the pokiest little thing. We didn't want her at all." "Well, Mrs. Gray introduced her, and said she was almost her niece, and I thought it seemed to be expected. Mrs. Gray is always polite to our visitors, you know, and I don't like to seem to slight any of hers. What's the matter with the girl?" "Oh, nothing's the matter. Only she's poky, and doesn't seem to fit in somehow. You would understand if you had seen her the day she came. Mrs. Gray has dressed her up, as you might be sure she would. But then she looked like the backwoods, didn't she, Ethel?" "She seemed nice appearing enough to day. You'll have to make the best you can of it, I guess, for Mrs. Gray accepted for her." "It doesn't really signify," said Berry discontentedly, "only it throws the party all out of shape. And she's younger than any of the rest, only just 17, Georgie says. She'd a great deal better stay at home with Marian." It was fortunate that Candace did not guess how unwelcome her company was to the getters up of the party, for the idea of the sail was most delightful to her. She had never been out in a boat in her life, not even on the smallest pond, and she had just discovered the strong fascination of the sea. She longed to get nearer to it, to know it better, and in her innocent little heart she thought, how very kind it was in Mrs. Joy to invite me. Sunday was always a particularly pleasant day at the Grays. Mrs. Gray was wont to declare that though she did not believe in the Jewish Sabbath, she did with all her heart believe in the Christian day of rest, and she took pains to make it a happy one for all under her roof. She gave her servants as much liberty as she could, simplified their work, and provided a plenty of good reading for such of them as stayed at home. Her own time was much more at the service of her family than it could be on ordinary days. She always took a walk with the girls in the cool of the afternoon, if the day were pleasant, and kept some book of a thoughtful kind to read aloud in the evenings. This Sunday it happened to be that wonderful little prose poem of Mrs. Oliphant's, "A Beleaguered City." Cannie found it absorbingly interesting, and even Mr. Gray lay aside his newspaper and listened to the very end. The reading done, Candace found a chance to ask her question about George Berkeley, Bishop of Cloyne, the donor of the organ. There was a story about him, as it turned out, and a very interesting one. Mrs. Gray told how, when Dean of Derry in Ireland, the project of establishing a college in Bermuda for the education of English boys and of Indian youths to act as missionaries to their own people, had taken possession of his mind, and he had given up his preferment, and crossed the sea with his family to engage in the chosen work. She described their landing in Newport on a Sunday morning when everybody was at church, and how the clergyman stopped in the middle of his sermon, and with all his congregation following him, hurried down to the waterside to receive the distinguished guest. She promised to take Candace out some day to see Whitehall, the house which he built on the island, and in which he lived for some years, till the impossibility of carrying out his scheme for Bermuda drove him back again to Ireland, and also the rocky shelf, still called Bishop Berkeley's Rock, where he is said to have composed the lines which begin, "Westward the course of empires takes its way." Then she looked up a photograph from Smibert's picture of Dean Berkeley and his family to show them, and by that time the girls had all grown interested, and when Marian said that she too wanted to go to see Whitehall, Georgie and Gertrude begged to be included also, and Mrs. Gray promised to take them all. "One of the dean's little children is buried in Trinity churchyard, Cannie," she ended. "You can look up the stone some day. It has 'Lucia Berkeley' carved upon it." "I should like to," said Cannie. "It has been so nice to hear about him. How many interesting things have happened in Newport! I should care a great deal more about that funny little organ next Sunday." Newport harbor shone all blue and silver in the sun as the party stepped on board the catboat Cornelia at sharp 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon. Mrs. Fred Allen, a tall, graceful brunette, seemed as much of a girl as any of the party which she was nominally to matronize, but she was married, though she didn't look it, as Berry Joy remarked, and so was qualified to fill the place. There was a fair wind, which sent the boat smoothly along, with little or no motion, as they glided past the long sunken shoal off the end of Goat Island, and opened the view of Brenton's Cove, with the wreck of the old slaver lying in the deep shadow under one bank, opposite the ribs of the other stranded bark, while from beyond in the laughing bay white-winged boats flitted to and fro, and seemed to beckon and make tempting signals to the poor defeated barks who might never sail or enjoy the sea again. Candace ventured to ask Gertrude, in a whisper, "What are those?" "Oh, only some old wrecks," replied Gertrude, carelessly, and she turned from Candace to talk to Tom Joy, who sat next to her. The Cornelia was now running on the favoring wind between Fort Adams and the Conanicut shore. On one hand lay Newport, which looked like a dream city in the soft shine of the afternoon. On the other was the long hill line of the island, green with grasses, except where broken now and then by rocky cliffs, and indented with innumerable little coves and inlets, some ending in strips of pebbly beach, others in stony shelves overhung by seaweeds. The water was beautiful in color, here pale fishing green, there purple in shadow, with gleams of golden light and a low reach of shimmering blue toward the horizon. On sped the little boat, till they could almost touch the ledges. The rounded outline of the old fortification on the upper hill towered above their heads. Then suddenly she curved and wheeled off on the other tack, with the sharp line of Castle Hill and the Agassiz Point full in view. Candace gazed with delighted eyes to left and right. Her mind was full of questions, but there seemed no one of whom she could ask them. Georgie and Berry were perched on the extreme point of the bow, with a young man stretched at their feet. Mrs. Fred was on the cabin roof amidships, with quite a little court of girls and young men about her. The couples who sat opposite and beside her seemed quite absorbed in each other. No one had spoken to Candace since the first introductions, and she was too shy to open a conversation with anybody. "How I wish I knew," she sighed to herself, half aloud. Looking up, she met the shrewd, twinkling eyes of the captain. Perhaps he had caught the words, for he asked encouragingly, "Did you speak, miss?" "No," said Candace, "I don't think I spoke. But I was wondering about that thing up there," pointing to the fort. "That? That's Fort Dumpling, as folks call it. It's a kind of queer old place, ain't it? They don't use it now for no war purposes, but it makes a pretty p'int up in the landscape, and folks go there for picnics and such in the summer season." "When was it built?" asked Candace, charmed to find somebody able and willing to satisfy her curiosity. Wal, I reckon it was about 1812, when we was a tacklin' the British for the last time. 'Tain't very much of a fort to look at, but if you was to mount some of them powerful guns they make now on the walls, them and the others over at Fort Adams yonder would protect the channel pretty well. The shot 'ud reach clear across. Why, you hardly think it, perhaps, but not more'n 4 or 5 years ago there was some folks who had come on a kind of excursion, taking their lunches up there by Fort Dumpling, and some soldiers was firing at a long range target over there to Fort Adams, and one of the balls came over and hit a young lady." "How dreadful!" said Candace, her eyes measuring the long distance between the 2 points. "And it seems so far away. I suppose the young lady felt perfectly safe. I am sure I should have. Did it kill her?" "Oh, no. They thought at first it had, but it didn't turn out so bad as was expected. The soldiers, they felt mighty mean, I expect. You see, they didn't intend a mite of harm to her or anybody, but it just shows how far them big guns carry nowadays. A warship now, unless she was some kind of a monitor or that, would stand a fair chance of being stove and sent to the bottom before she could get back in to attack Newport." "What a funny little house that is down to the water," remarked Candace, looking off to the opposite shore. "That's Professor Agassiz's laboratory. Do you see that kind of a cove which sets in there near by the building, and a little black thing sticking up out of it? That's the pipe of his steam launch. He and the rest go out in it and dredge for fish and such like, and then they experiment on them inside." "What do they do that for?" asked Candace. "Wal, they want to find out about 'em, I reckon. I was in there once and saw them at work, but I couldn't make nothing out of it, and there wasn't anybody I could ask." "Oh, what is that?" cried Candace, as the Cornelia, tacking again, opened one of the little bays on the south end of Etiquette, where a small steam vessel was lying. 2 boats, which seemed to belong to her, were rowing in a parallel line with each other, and behind them appeared a long line of bobbing points, which she could not at all understand. "That's one of the fishing steamers, and the boats are drawing her nets," explained the captain. "Did you ever see a seine drawn before? Well, I declare, I'm mighty glad we happened just in time, for it's a cur'ous spectacle. I guess we'll kind of hang about till they get the nets in, and then I'll take the Cornelia up near enough for you to see." "Captain, there are the seine boats out," called Tom Joy at the same moment. "Let's sail up and see what they've caught." The 2 boats began to near each other as they reached the limits of the long elliptical curves which made their course, and presently a great number of scintillating specks were seen in the space enclosed between them. There were the leaping fish, just conscious that they were crowded into a confined space, and desirous of escape. When they were quite close to one another, the boats turned and began to row for the steamer. The Cornelia followed, and the captain, with a twist of the tiller, threw her into the wind just beyond the great net, which by that time was being rapidly hauled in. It was a wonderful thing to see, the heavy mass of floundering fishes pouring over into the steamer's hold. Thousands and thousands of quivering silvery shapes of all kinds, from the fat oily bodied menhaden to weird horned monsters with gaping mouths, and strange half translucent blocks like jelly, which seemed to have no mouths at all. Large and small, pinky white, black, blue, in they poured. Now and then some fish more lucky than his fellows would splash over the side of the net and escape to liberty and the deep sea. Now and then a fisherman with a sudden dash of his hand would single out a specimen choicer than the rest, a bluefish, a chicken cod, or a sea bass. The little company in the sailboat shared all the excitement of the catch. The young men left their flotations for the boat's side, where they could get a better view. A great deal of chaff went on between Captain Davis and the captain of the menhaden steamer. Tom Joy amused himself by bargaining for bluefish, and actually bought 3 big flapping specimens for $1.25. They were deposited on the bottom of the Cornelia, where they leaped painfully up and down, while the girls retreated for refuge to the upper deck, till Captain Davis at last caught the fish and stowed them away in his little cabin. It was not till the last loop of the seine was emptied, the last fish secured, and the boats were making ready for another cast, that the Cornelia finally glided away, and by that time A soft crimson glow had gathered in the west, and the sun was nearing the horizon edge. The wind blew more freshly now, and with a zest and coolness which it had not had earlier in the afternoon. Captain Davis pointed out to Candace the lightship anchored in the offing between Point Judith and Brenton's Reef, and told her how the men who lived on board of her did not see a face from land for weeks together sometimes, when winds were stormy and waves rough. Candace listened eagerly. The rest of the party had gone back to their old places, but there was not so much chatter now. The dreamy influences of the hour were felt by everyone. Dick Foster was quoting Tennyson in a low voice to pretty Julia Prime. Berry Joy and Georgie still kept up a fitful conversation with their cavalier, but Gertrude had grown silent, and Tom Joy was whistling softly to himself, with his eyes fixed on the sunset. The Cornelia sped silently seaward. Suddenly they were in the shadow of a deep cove at the very end of Etiquette, and close by them rose out of the sea an immense square table of rock, over which, still as it was, the surge was constantly flinging showers of white spray. The whole top of this rock was black with large sea birds. Candace had never imagined such a sight. The birds seemed crowding each other on every inch of space. Each moment some of them would rise, wheel in the air with wild cries and screams, and then settle again to dispute for room, while the seething foam splashed over them, and the incessant flutter of their wings, the dashing spray, and the long wash of waves at the base of the rock gave to their place of refuge the effect of movement, so that it seemed to sway and float in the sea. "Oh, what a wonderful place!" cried Candace. "Such big birds, and so many of them! What do you call them, Captain?" "Wall, they're mostly cormorants and gulls, I reckon. That's what we call them down to Newport. They ain't no good for eating, so they don't get shot, and they do increase powerfully, though it seems to me I never did see quite so many on the Kettle Bottom before as this afternoon." "Is that the name of the rock?" "Yes, the Kettle Bottom Rock. That's what it's called. It's a queer place. There was a painter here last summer, and he made a picture of it, with them birds all flying over it, which folks said was like as like." The line of hotels on Narragansett Beach was now plainly in sight. They were almost off Beaver Tail, and the sea was rougher. "Captain, we may as well put about," said Tom Joy. "The sun's going down, and there's rather more motion hereabouts than the ladies like." So they put about and sped harborward, helped by the tide which was now running swiftly in. Frank Rivington began to sing in a mellow tenor voice little barcaroles and Venetian boat songs, which were full of measured rhythmic movement like oar strokes and the beat of waves. The pink in the west deepened after the sun went down to a vivid orange red, and flamed higher and higher till the zenith caught the glow, and a little crescent moon, which was climbing up, swung like a tiny silver boat on a crimson tide. It was all like a dream, to which the noiseless speed of the boat offered no interruption. "Good night, Captain," said Candace gently as the Cornelia touched the wharf, at the upper end of which the carriages were waiting for them. "I'm so much obliged to you for telling me all about the things." "You're welcome, I'm sure," replied the hearty Captain. "It's been nothing but a pleasure so far as I'm concerned. Hope I may take you out sailing again, miss." "Oh, I hope so. I think sailing is lovely." "Good bye, Miss Arden. I hope you have enjoyed it," said Mrs. Allen, as she was borne off by her husband. It was the sole remark addressed by the matron of the party to the little stranger under her care during that afternoon, but Candace had not felt neglected. "Oh yes, very much, thank you," she replied. Tom Joy, who had waked up to the sense that the little girl in the red hat had not had much attention paid her on the sail, tried to get up a conversation as the beach wagon climbed the hill, but Candace had but little small talk at her command, and they did not get on very fluently. "I've had a lovely time, Miss Joy," she said shyly, as they were set down at home. "I'm sure I'm glad. Good night, Miss Arden." And that was all the notice which Berenice Joy took of her youngest guest, beyond the necessary good afternoon when they first met on the wharf. Candace was too unexacting, and too much accustomed to think of herself as a child to whom no particular attention was due, to realize or resent being treated with this scant courtesy. She told Cousin Kate about the sail and the Seine steamer, and all the captain's tales and explanations, with a glow of enjoyment which surprised Gertrude, and perhaps pricked her conscience somewhat, for that night, at hair–brushing time, she surprised Georgie by the observation, "After all, Cannie is quite a sweet little thing." "So she is, sweet enough. But what makes you think of it just now?" "Why, we rather left her out this afternoon, I am afraid. Hardly anybody said a word to her, except the captain. It was rude enough of Berry, for it was her party; but I think it was worse for us. Any other girl would have been hurt and cross, and showed it. But Cannie never seemed to mind a bit, and enjoyed everything, and was just as nice and pleasant as if she had been the belle of the party." "Well, it was too bad," said Georgie, penitently. "I never thought about it, and I sat ever so far off from her, and Arnold Foster was so funny. In fact, I forgot Cannie. I took it for granted that she was being entertained somehow." "I'm afraid both of us find it pretty easy to forget Cannie," remarked Gertrude. "Well, I shall try to do better another time." CHAPTER VI.